What if an entire advanced civilization once existed and was completely erased from history? Old maps from the 16th and 17th centuries clearly show a massive empire called Tartaria, stretching across huge parts of the world. Yet today, most history books barely mention it. Even stranger, many grand buildings across Europe and America show architectural styles some researchers believe could be linked to this forgotten civilization. So what really happened to the Tartarian Empire? Was it just a misunderstood name on old maps, or evidence of a powerful civilization that history tried to hide? In this video, we'll explore the mystery, the maps, and the theories behind the lost empire of Tartaria. There is a map. You have probably never been shown this map in school. It is not obscure. It exists in libraries, in archives, in university collections around the world. It is not forged, not fabricated, not disputed by serious historians. It is simply there, waiting to be looked at, and what it shows has the power to completely unravel everything you think you know about the last 500 years of human civilization. The map is from the year 1806. It was produced by John Cary, one of the most respected cartographers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Cary was not a fringe figure. He was official mapmaker to the British Post Office. His work was used by the British government, by military commanders, by navigators crossing the world's oceans. When John Cary drew something on a map, it was because it was real. And on this particular map, a map of the known world, published at the height of the British Empire's expansion, there it is, stretching across an almost incomprehensible expanse of the Earth's surface, Tartaria, or as some editions render it, Tartari, Grand Tartari, the Great Tartarian Empire. It covers most of what we today call Russia, Central Asia, China, Mongolia, and parts of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. It is enormous, not a small territory, not a minor kingdom, not a footnote, but a civilizational entity so large that at its apparent geographic extent, it dwarfs every other political entity on the map. The British Empire, celebrated as the largest empire in human history, looks modest by comparison. The Roman Empire at its peak would fit inside it with room to spare, and yet you have never heard of it. You have heard of the Romans, you have heard of the Mongols, the Persians, the Ottomans, the Byzantines, the Aztecs, the Han dynasty. You have studied the rise and fall of empires in school, in textbooks, in documentaries. Empires are well-documented phenomena. The mechanisms of their expansion, consolidation, and collapse are among the most studied topics in all of historical scholarship. And yet the largest empire ever depicted on any map, an empire that appears on European cartography for over 400 years, from the 1500s to the early 1800s, has left, according to official history, almost no trace. No ruins, no documented governance structure, no surviving language, no continuous cultural tradition, no acknowledged technological legacy. It simply disappeared, or rather, it was made to disappear. This documentary is about what Tartaria was. It is about the civilization that built it, the technology it possessed, the architecture it erected, and the remarkable and deeply troubling story of how it was erased from the human record. It is about the clues left behind, hiding in plain sight in old photographs, in architectural styles, in suppressed documents, in the buried foundations of buildings that predate the cities supposedly built on top of them. It is about the cover-up that followed what researchers are increasingly calling a global catastrophic reset, an event or series of events that ended the Tartarian civilization and ushered in the world order we know today. And it is about why understanding this history matters enormously for how we understand the present. The Tartarian Empire, the advanced civilization erased from history. To understand Tartaria, we have to go back to the maps, not just one map, but hundreds of them. European cartography from the 1500s onward is extraordinarily consistent on one point. There was a vast territorial entity in the eastern portion of the world, and it was called Tartary, or Tartaria. The term appears in maps produced by every major European cartographic tradition: Italian, Dutch, French, German, British, Spanish, Portuguese. It appears in the work of Gerardus Mercator, whose projection of the globe is still used in modified form today. It appears in the atlases of Abraham Ortelius, whose 1570 Theatrum Orbis Terrarum is considered the first modern atlas. It appears in the work of Guillaume de Lisle, who served as the official cartographer to the King of France. It appears in maps commissioned by the Holy Roman Empire, by the Dutch East India Company, by the Russian imperial court itself. The word Tartaria does not appear once or twice or a handful of times in historical European cartography. It appears on virtually every significant map produced between roughly 1540 and 1815. For approximately 275 years, any educated European who consulted a map of the world would have seen Tartaria. A child in France learning geography in 1700 would have known that Tartaria existed, roughly where it was, and approximately how large it was. A merchant planning a trade route through Central Asia in 1650 would have known he was entering Tartarian territory. An English traveler writing letters home from the eastern reaches of Russia in 1780 would have described the locals as Tartars, inhabitants of Tartary, and his contemporaries would have understood exactly what he meant. How, then, did this entity simply vanish from human consciousness within a generation? How does something that appeared on every map produced for nearly 3 centuries disappear so completely that today, 200 years later, the vast majority of educated people in the Western world have never heard of it? The mainstream explanation, and there is one, though it is rarely articulated with much force or detail, is that Tartary was simply a vague European catch-all term for the uncivilized peoples of Central Asia, that it referred not to any organized political entity, but to a loose collection of nomadic tribes, that it was a cartographic convention inherited from medieval geography that gradually fell out of use as European explorers and conquerors came to better understand the true political realities of Central Asia. That Tartary was, in short, not real. Not in the sense that France or England or China was real. It was a label Europeans attached to a vast, unknown territory, and as that territory became known, the label became obsolete and was discarded. This explanation is almost universally accepted in academic circles, and in certain narrow respects, it contains fragments of truth. The European understanding of Central Asia in the 16th century was, indeed, imperfect. There were, indeed, various nomadic peoples across the Eurasian steppe who were loosely grouped under the Tartar designation by European observers. But as an explanation for the totality of what the maps show, for the consistency and specificity with which Tartaria is depicted across hundreds of years and dozens of independent cartographic traditions, for the sheer physical scale of what those maps describe, the mainstream explanation collapses almost immediately under scrutiny. Consider what the maps actually show. They do not merely indicate a vague territory labeled with a generic name. They show borders, they show capitals, they show subdivisions, Lesser Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. They show rivers, mountain ranges, cities, trade routes. They assign to Tartaria all the attributes that contemporary cartographers assign to genuine political entities. When Ortelius drew France, he showed its borders, its provinces, its major cities, its geography. When he drew Tartaria, he did the same thing. The level of cartographic specificity applied to Tartaria is not consistent with it being a vague catch-all for unknown lands. It is consistent with European cartographers describing something they understood to be, and perhaps directly knew to be, a real, organized, geographically bounded entity with identifiable internal structures. Furthermore, the historical record is full of European observers who encountered and wrote about the Tartars, not as vague abstractions, but as specific peoples with specific customs, specific governance structures, specific cities, and specific technologies. Marco Polo's famous account of his travels through Central Asia and China in the 13th century describes a world of extraordinary sophistication. The Mongol Empire, which controlled much of this same territory in the 13th and 14th centuries, was, as mainstream historians acknowledge, one of the most administratively capable empires in pre-modern history. It operated a postal relay system called the YAM that could transmit information thousands of miles in days. It maintained religious tolerance, promoted trade, and built infrastructure. When the Mongol Empire fractured into successor states in the 14th century, those successor states, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan dynasty, continued to exercise sophisticated governance over vast territories. The people living in these territories did not suddenly become uncivilized nomads because the Mongol imperial superstructure had dissolved. They were the same people living in the same places with the same accumulated cultural knowledge. What researchers studying the Tartarian question are increasingly arguing is that the mainstream dismissal of Tartaria as a cartographic fiction is itself a kind of fiction, a narrative constructed after the fact to explain away something that powerful interests found inconvenient. And those interests, they argue, had very specific reasons for wanting the world to forget that Tartaria had existed. To understand why, we need to understand not just what the maps show, but what independent historical sources say about the people and civilization of the region. And here, the story becomes significantly more remarkable. The word Tartar, or Tatar in its more modern rendering, appears in European sources as early as the 13th century, when the Mongol armies of Genghis Khan and his successors burst out of the eastern steppe and swept across Russia, Poland, Hungary, and Persia with a speed and coordination that stunned contemporaries. European chroniclers, trying to make sense of this apparently irresistible force from the east, reached for a word from Roman geography: Tartarus, the underworld, the land of the dead. These people, these Tartars, had come as if from Tartarus itself, hence the name, or so one popular etymology goes. Another suggests a corruption of the word Dada or Tata, terms used by various nomadic peoples of the steppe. Whatever the etymology, the important thing is that from this point forward, European documents consistently describe a large, organized, and formidable civilizational presence in the East. And while the academic mainstream tends to attribute all of this simply to the Mongol Empire and its successors, there are researchers who argue that the Mongol Empire was itself merely the most recent and most visible manifestation of a much older and much deeper civilizational continuity, a continuity that stretches back far further than the 13th century, and that represents something qualitatively different from what official history describes. Let's talk about what those researchers are finding and why it has provoked such fierce resistance from established scholars. The modern Tartarian research community, and make no mistake, it is a community numbering in the hundreds of thousands of active participants across forums, video channels, independent publishing ventures, and research networks, coalesced in approximately 2016 to 2018, though its intellectual roots go considerably further back. The catalysts were several. One was the growing accessibility of digitized historical archives, old maps, old photographs, old architectural surveys, old government documents, that made it possible for ordinary people, not just credentialed academics, to examine primary sources directly. Another was the proliferation of video sharing platforms that allowed researchers to present their findings to mass audiences without the gatekeeping of academic publishing. A third was a general cultural turn toward questioning institutional narratives, a turn that, whatever one thinks of its political dimensions, has also produced genuine and valuable re-examinations of officially sanctioned history. What these researchers noticed, when they started looking carefully at the historical record, was a set of anomalies. Individually, each anomaly might be explainable within the conventional historical framework. Together, they constitute something much more difficult to dismiss. The first anomaly is architectural. Across the territory traditionally associated with Tartaria, Russia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and importantly, much of North America and Western Europe, there exists a remarkable consistency of architectural style in buildings supposedly constructed across a span of centuries and by supposedly unconnected civilizations. The style is characterized by certain recurring features: massive scale, extraordinary structural precision, elaborate ornamentation featuring specific recurring motifs, and a peculiar orientation toward both celestial alignment and what some researchers argue was energy collection and distribution. These buildings, churches, government buildings, railway stations, hospitals, universities, city halls, share a vocabulary that crosses supposed cultural, geographic, and temporal boundaries in ways that conventional architectural history has difficulty explaining. The second anomaly is demographic. The official historical record of the 19th century contains numerous accounts of cities in North America, Russia, and other territories that describe them as essentially new, recently founded, recently built, recently populated. San Francisco, Chicago, Denver, St. Louis, and dozens of other American cities are presented in official histories as having been built largely from scratch between roughly 1840 and 1880. A period of explosive construction that produced, within a single generation, enormous and architecturally sophisticated urban environments. But photographs of these cities taken in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s show buildings of extraordinary complexity and refinement, buildings whose construction, by conventional accounts, would have required decades of skilled labor and resources that the supposedly young cities simply did not have. How were these buildings built? By whom? And why do so many of them share architectural features with buildings supposedly constructed in entirely different parts of the world at entirely different times? The third anomaly is geological. In many parts of the world, particularly in urban areas, the ground level of 19th century construction is significantly higher than what one would expect from natural deposition alone. Buildings from the supposed early settlement period of American cities have been found to have their lower floors buried, not because they sank, but because the ground around them rose. Windows and doors that would have opened at street level are now below ground. In some cases, entire lower stories have been excavated by researchers and found to be perfectly preserved, clearly designed as habitable or functional spaces, and yet now buried under several feet of sediment. Something, the Tartarian researchers argue, covered these structures, not slowly through centuries of natural accumulation, but rapidly in a geological event of considerable scale. They call this event the mud flood. We will return to the mud flood in detail in part 2 of this documentary, but for now, it is important to understand its significance for the broader Tartarian narrative. If there was a large-scale geological event in the 19th century, perhaps sometime between 1800 and 1870, that buried large portions of existing urban infrastructure under a layer of sediment, then several things follow. First, there was infrastructure to be buried, meaning there was a prior civilization that had built it. Second, the event would have killed or displaced large numbers of people, meaning the surviving population in the aftermath would have been reduced and disrupted. Third, those who survived and those who arrived in the aftermath to establish new governance structures would have been dealing with a landscape that was, in significant ways, already built, already urbanized, already infrastructure rich, and they would have had to make a choice about how to describe this inheritance. The Tartarian researchers argue that the choice was made to claim these structures as new construction, to present the grand buildings of the pre-flood civilization as the products of the newly established post-flood order. And this choice was not accidental or innocent. It was deliberate, systematic, and enforced. It required the active suppression of historical memory, the destruction of documentary evidence, and the construction of a false historical narrative. A narrative that placed the founding of civilization firmly in the post-flood period and wrote the pre-flood world out of existence. The scale of this alleged suppression is enormous. If the Tartarian researchers are correct, we are not talking about the distortion of a minor historical footnote. We are talking about the fabrication, from whole cloth, of the entire origin story of modern Western civilization. We are talking about a deception so comprehensive and so sustained that it has successfully concealed from the majority of humanity the true nature of the civilization that preceded the current world order. We are talking, in short, about the greatest historical cover-up in the history of the world. That is a very large claim, and it demands very serious evidence. The evidence, the researchers say, is everywhere. It is in the old maps, it is in the old photographs, it is in the architecture that surrounds us daily, it is in suppressed government documents, it is in the testimonies of travelers who visited these territories in the early 19th century and described things that don't fit the official narrative. It is in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples around the world who describe, in remarkably consistent terms, a previous age of advanced civilization that was destroyed by a catastrophe. It is in the geology of the land itself. Let us begin with the maps, and with what they can tell us, not just about the size and location of Tartaria, but about its nature. The most striking thing about historical European maps of Tartaria, when you look at them carefully, is not the size of the territory, but the specificity of the information they contain. There are maps that show not just the rough outlines of the territory, but its internal political subdivisions, its river systems, its mountain ranges, its major population centers. There are maps that show distinct regions of Tartaria, Chinese Tartary, roughly corresponding to Mongolia and Manchuria, independent Tartary, the central steppe regions, Muscovite Tartary, the parts under nominal Russian control, and what is sometimes called Grand Tartary or Great Tartaria, the heartland of the civilization, centered on the lands between the Ural Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, roughly corresponding to what is now Siberia and Central Asia. These maps also show cities, not just nomadic encampments or tribal territories, but actual cities with names, locations, and in some cases, architectural features noted in accompanying texts. Cities like Sibir, Tobolsk, Samarkand, Bukhara, and numerous others appear consistently in the Tartarian cartographic tradition. And while some of these cities survive to this day under the same or slightly modified names, others do not. They appear on old maps and then vanish, their locations now occupied by empty steppe or modern industrial settlements with no apparent connection to whatever came before. Samarkand is particularly instructive. Today known as one of the great cities of Central Asia, a UNESCO World Heritage Site celebrated for its extraordinary Islamic architecture, Samarkand was a major city on the Silk Road for centuries. Mentioned by Greek historians, visited by Alexander the Great, described in detail by medieval Islamic travelers. Its famous Registan Square, with its 3 enormous madrasas, is dated by official history to the 15th and 16th centuries. But when Tartarian researchers look at Samarkand, they see something the official historical narrative doesn't adequately address. The architectural features of its great buildings show a degree of precision and sophistication that, by the standards of 15th century Central Asian construction techniques, should not be possible. The tile work, the mathematical perfection of the geometric patterns, the structural engineering of the enormous iwans and minarets. These features demand explanations that go beyond the standard narrative of pre-modern Islamic architecture. This is not to say that the buildings of Samarkand are not Islamic in their decorative vocabulary. They clearly are, or at least they are decorated in the Islamic aesthetic tradition, but the researchers argue that the buildings themselves, the underlying structures, predate the Islamic decoration applied to them, that what we see in Samarkand, as in many of the great architectural sites of Central Asia, is a structure built by an earlier civilization, subsequently appropriated and redecorated by whoever came after. This pattern of architectural appropriation, older structure, later decoration, is, the researchers argue, one of the most consistent features of the post-Tartarian world, visible not just in Central Asia but around the globe. The map evidence becomes even more provocative when we look at the period immediately preceding the disappearance of Tartaria from cartographic convention. The early 19th century, roughly 1800 to 1830, is a period of extraordinary cartographic activity. The great powers of Europe are engaged in intense competition for global territorial control. They are commissioning detailed surveys of every part of the world they can access. The technology of cartography is improving rapidly. Maps are becoming more accurate, more detailed, and more systematically derived from actual survey data rather than from earlier maps and traveler accounts. And during this exact period, this period of maximum cartographic accuracy and maximum geographic knowledge, Tartaria begins to disappear from the maps. Not in one sudden erasure, but gradually. The territory that had been labeled Tartaria for centuries is subdivided, renamed, reattributed. Portions are absorbed into the Russian Empire. Portions are relabeled as Chinese territory. Portions become, simply unnamed, white space on the map, or space filled with geographic features but no political designation. By 1850, Tartaria has essentially vanished from European cartography. By 1900, it is so thoroughly gone that educated Europeans and Americans of that generation would have been as unfamiliar with it as their descendants are today. What happened? The official explanation, as noted earlier, is that Tartaria was simply a label that became obsolete as accurate geographic knowledge replaced vague medieval convention. But this explanation struggles with the timing. The disappearance of Tartaria from the maps coincides precisely with the period of the Napoleonic Wars, the expansion of the Russian Empire deep into Central Asia, and, crucially, with the period in which the mud flood is hypothesized to have occurred. It also coincides with the founding of many of the world's most important historical and cultural institutions: the Smithsonian Institution in America, the British Museum in England, the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, institutions whose mandate, among other things, was to define and preserve the official historical record. The timing is not, the researchers argue, coincidental. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can fully appreciate the significance of Tartaria's disappearance, we need to understand, as fully as possible, what Tartaria actually was. What kind of civilization are we talking about? What did the people of Tartaria believe, build, know, and do? What was the nature of the society that the maps indicate was the dominant territorial presence on Earth for at least 3 centuries? The answers to these questions come from multiple sources, from the old maps, from historical texts, from architectural evidence, and from a careful reading of sources that have been largely sidelined by mainstream history. Let us begin with the most accessible source: what European travelers and scholars who actually visited Tartarian territories described. There is a remarkable body of literature produced between roughly 1500 and 1800 that consists of accounts by European travelers who ventured into Central Asia and brought back descriptions of what they found. These travelers, explorers, merchants, diplomats, missionaries, came from every major European country and from every social class. Their accounts are held in archives and libraries around the world. They have been studied selectively by academic historians, but the Tartarian researchers argue that they have been selectively studied, with inconvenient details quietly passed over. What these accounts consistently describe is a civilization of considerable sophistication, not primitive nomads, not chaotic tribal societies, but organized, urbanized, technologically capable peoples living in cities with established governance, specialized economic roles, and a rich cultural and intellectual life. The cities of Central Asia that appear in these accounts, Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, Urgench, Merv, are described as large, beautiful, wealthy, and well-ordered. Their markets sell goods from every corner of the world. Their inhabitants are literate. Their buildings are impressive. Their rulers maintain courts comparable in sophistication to those of contemporary European monarchies. The great Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited Central Asia in the 1330s, described the city of Urgench as one of the largest cities in the world, with bazaars so crowded that the press of people made movement difficult. The Flemish friar William of Rubruck, who traveled to the court of the Great Khan in 1253 and 1254 on behalf of King Louis IX of France, described a civilization of extraordinary organizational capability, where messages could travel thousands of miles in days, and where the logistics of feeding and supplying enormous armies were handled with an efficiency that European nations of the same period could not match. The Italian adventurer Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who traveled to the Mongol capital of Karakorum in 1245-1247, described a city with enormous palaces, streets organized by trade, and a cultural life that included scholars and craftsmen from every nation the Mongols had conquered. These accounts are not fringe documents. They are primary sources that mainstream historians rely upon regularly, and while mainstream historians interpret them as evidence of Mongol imperial organization, the Tartarian researchers ask a different question. Where did this organizational capacity come from? The Mongols of the 12th century, as officially described, were a relatively small group of nomadic pastoralists living on the eastern steppe. In one generation, under Genghis Khan, they supposedly built the largest contiguous land empire in history. They supposedly figured out from scratch how to administer vast territories, maintain communication networks across thousands of miles, manage diverse subject populations with different languages and religions, build cities, and conduct sophisticated diplomacy with every major power from China to the Pope. The mainstream account asks us to accept an almost miraculous leap in organizational and administrative capability accomplished in one generation by a population with no prior experience of large-scale governance. The Tartarian researchers propose a different reading. The Mongols did not build this system from scratch. They inherited it. The organizational infrastructure, the roads, the relay stations, the communication networks, the administrative frameworks, already existed as part of the older Tartarian civilization that the Mongols had conquered and, in significant measure, simply taken over. The Mongol Empire was not the creation of a new civilization, but the temporary consolidation of an older one under new management. This argument is more subtle than it might initially appear. It does not require us to invent a civilization from nothing. It does not require us to discard everything we know about the Mongols. It simply reframes the Mongol achievement within a longer continuity. The steppe peoples of Central Asia had been organized, trading, and communicating across vast distances for millennia before Genghis Khan. The archaeological record of the Eurasian steppe is full of evidence for complex societies, sophisticated metallurgy, long-distance trade networks, and organized warfare that predate the Mongol Empire by centuries or millennia. The mainstream historical account tends to see these earlier steppe societies as proto-civilizational, as building blocks toward, but not constituting, genuine civilization. The Tartarian researchers argue that this assessment is wrong, that the steppe societies of pre-Mongol Central Asia were not building towards civilization, they were a civilization. A sophisticated, organized, technologically capable civilization that the Mongol conquest disrupted and partially destroyed, but that continued to exist in modified form afterward, and that is what appears on the European maps as Tartaria. What was the cultural identity of this civilization? Here, the evidence becomes more complex and, from the perspective of mainstream history, more uncomfortable. The peoples who appear in historical sources under the Tartarian label were diverse, ethnically, linguistically, and religiously. They included Turkic peoples, Mongolian peoples, Iranian peoples, and various others. Their religious practices ranged from Buddhism to Islam to shamanism to, in some cases, forms of Christianity. Specifically, Nestorian Christianity, which had been a significant religious presence in Central Asia since at least the 7th century CE, and which maintained a church network extending from Syria to China. The diversity of the Tartarian peoples is one reason mainstream historians resist the idea of a unified Tartarian civilization. How, they ask, can you have a single civilization composed of such diverse peoples? But this objection misunderstands how large civilizations work. Rome was diverse, ethnically, linguistically, religiously. The British Empire was diverse. The Mongol Empire itself was diverse. Diversity is not an obstacle to civilizational unity. It is, in many cases, a product of it. The Tartarian researchers argue that what unified the peoples of the Tartarian world was not ethnic or linguistic homogeneity, but something deeper, a shared cosmology, a shared architectural tradition, a shared understanding of the natural world, and, they argue, a shared technological tradition that gave the civilization its distinctive character. This technological tradition is, perhaps, the most remarkable and most contested aspect of the Tartarian hypothesis. When modern people look at old photographs taken in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s in cities across America, Russia, and Europe, they frequently notice something strange. The buildings in these photographs are enormous, not just large by the standards of the time, but in many cases, larger than anything being built in those same cities today. The proportion of the windows is extraordinary, 12, 15, 20 feet high. The ornamental detail is staggering. Carved stonework, elaborate ironwork, painted ceilings, mosaic floors. The structural engineering is impressive. Arched roofs spanning spaces that modern engineers would need steel and reinforced concrete to replicate. These buildings were supposedly built by hand by immigrant laborers in newly founded cities that had existed for only a few decades at most. The researchers who first noticed this discrepancy asked a simple question: how were these buildings built? And the answer that began to emerge from their research was deeply unsettling to conventional assumptions. The answer, they argue, is that these buildings were not built in the 19th century at all. They were already there, built by the preceding Tartarian civilization, whose technology and organizational capacity made such construction not only possible but routine. What the 19th century contributed was not the construction of these buildings, but the story attached to them, the retrospective narrative claiming them as the product of the new civilization rather than the old one. This claim leads naturally to the question that the Tartarian hypothesis most urgently presses. What was the technology of the Tartarian civilization? How did they build what they apparently built? What was the nature of their relationship to the physical world that enabled construction on a scale and at a level of precision that we today, with all of our industrial capacity, find difficult to replicate? The answers to these questions, the researchers argue, are connected to another persistent anomaly in the historical record: the extraordinary prevalence across the supposed Tartarian world of a specific architectural feature, a feature that appears on buildings of every apparent type, in every supposed culture, on every continent. The dome, combined with towers, combined with specific geometric proportions that researchers argue are not merely aesthetic, but functional. Functional, they claim, as energy collection and distribution devices. We will return to this claim, the claim of Tartarian free energy technology, in detail in Part 3, but its relevance here, in our discussion of the nature of Tartarian civilization, is this: if the Tartarian civilization possessed a technology for collecting and distributing energy without the combustion of fuel, if they had solved, in other words, the fundamental energy problem that drives our current industrial civilization, then many other things become explicable. The scale of their construction becomes explicable. The speed of their construction becomes explicable. The geographic reach of their civilization, the ability to maintain organized societies across enormous distances in the absence of the fossil fuel-powered transportation that we depend on today, becomes explicable, and the motivation for suppressing knowledge of this civilization becomes very clear indeed. We are, it should be said clearly at this point, in territory that is vigorously contested. The arguments we are presenting in this documentary are not the consensus view of mainstream historians, archaeologists, or scientists. They are the arguments of a community of independent researchers who are questioning an official narrative and offering an alternative reading of the evidence. The mainstream academic establishment dismisses these arguments, often without engagement, as conspiracy theory, as the product of pattern-seeking minds finding meaning in coincidence, of people who have misread old maps, misunderstood architectural history, and misinterpreted geological evidence. But this documentary takes the view that dismissal is not refutation, that the consistency and coherence of the Tartarian hypothesis, the way it connects so many otherwise disconnected anomalies into a single explanatory framework, deserves serious engagement rather than institutional ridicule. That the people who have developed this hypothesis, many of them working outside the academy, without professional credentials or institutional support, driven purely by curiosity and a genuine desire to understand the world as it actually is, deserve to be heard. And so we are going to look at the evidence, carefully, in detail, without assuming we already know the answer. Let us now look at one specific piece of evidence that sits at the very foundation of the Tartarian argument, one that we believe is difficult to explain away within the conventional historical framework. In 1818, John Cleves Symmes Jr., a former captain in the United States Army, published a circular addressed to all the world, specifically to every learned society and institution in the United States, Europe, and Russia, claiming that the Earth was hollow and accessible via openings at the poles. Symmes is routinely dismissed today as a crank, and his hollow Earth theory is, in its specific details, scientifically indefensible. But the interesting thing about Symmes is not his theory. It is the context in which his theory appeared. He was writing in 1818, at the very moment when the cartographic tradition of Tartaria was disappearing from the maps. He was writing at a moment of intense American and European interest in the unexplored regions of the world, the Arctic, the Antarctic, the interior of Central Asia. And his circular, whatever its scientific merits, was taken seriously enough to be transmitted to every learned institution in the world. Why does this matter? Because Symmes and the circle of thinkers around him were drawing on a tradition of geographic and cosmological speculation that had its roots in a pre-existing understanding of the world, an understanding that included Tartaria as a real and significant civilizational entity. The interest in the hollow Earth, in the poles, in hidden worlds beneath the surface is not random. The Tartarian researchers argue that it reflects, in distorted form, a genuine tradition of knowledge, Tartarian knowledge, about the true nature of the Earth and the technologies available for working with it. The hollow Earth theory is a garbled popular version of something more specific and more technical, a Tartarian understanding of the Earth's electromagnetic and telluric properties that was, in the early 19th century, beginning to leak into mainstream awareness before being firmly suppressed. This is, admittedly, highly speculative territory, but it illustrates the methodology of the Tartarian research community, the search for patterns, for consistencies, for the traces of a suppressed knowledge tradition that appear in unexpected places and unexpected forms. And this methodology, applied across hundreds of independent researchers working over the better part of a decade, has produced a body of findings that is, taken as a whole, extremely difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The maps show Tartaria. The architecture reflects Tartaria. The geology suggests a catastrophic event that disrupted Tartaria. The history of the 19th century, read carefully, shows the deliberate construction of a post-Tartarian world order, and the individuals who have most powerfully opposed the official narrative, from Symmes in 1818 to Nikola Tesla in the early 20th century, to the independent researchers of today, share a common thread. They are all, in some way, working with or against the same suppressed knowledge tradition. This is not a story about a small historical error. It is not a story about a misattributed archaeological site or a misread ancient text. It is a story about the total rewriting of human history, about the systematic replacement of one civilization's story with another's, conducted with such thoroughness and over such a long period that the original story has been nearly completely lost. But nearly completely is not completely. The clues are there, the maps are there, the architecture is there, the geology is there, and increasingly, the researchers are there. Patient, systematic, persistent, unwilling to accept the non-answer of institutional dismissal. The question is not whether Tartaria existed. The maps are too consistent, too numerous, too authoritative to deny. The question is what Tartaria was. And the answer to that question, as we will discover over the next 5 parts of this documentary, is far more remarkable and far more consequential than anything official history has seen fit to tell us. The Mud Flood and the Great Reset. The Tartarian researchers accept that the street levels were raised. What they dispute is the official explanation for why. They argue that the raising of street levels in cities across America and elsewhere in the mid-19th century was not a deliberate engineering project, but a response to a natural catastrophe, a catastrophic deposition of sediment that buried the lower floors of existing buildings in a layer of mud and earth. And they argue that the official story of deliberate street raising was constructed after the fact to explain away the physical evidence of this catastrophe and conceal what it implied about the age and nature of the civilization whose buildings were buried. This is the mud flood hypothesis, and it is, in many ways, the cornerstone of the entire Tartarian argument because it provides a physical mechanism for the claimed civilizational transition. If a catastrophic flood of mud, water, and debris swept across large portions of the Earth's surface sometime in the early to mid-19th century, it would explain why so many buildings of apparent pre-modern construction are found buried below current street level. It would explain why so many American cities seem to have been founded on a landscape that already contained infrastructure. It would explain the demographic disruptions and population discontinuities visible in the historical record of this period. And it would explain why the survivors of this event, or the new power structures that emerged in its aftermath, would have had strong incentives to construct a false historical narrative that attributed the existing built environment to their own construction rather than to the civilization the mud flood destroyed. Let us examine the physical evidence for the mud flood in detail. The most striking evidence comes from photographs and historical records of cities in the American West, particularly San Francisco, Sacramento, Portland, and Seattle. These are cities that, according to official history, were founded in the mid-19th century and grew rapidly from small settlements to major urban centers in the space of a decade or two. The standard historical narrative presents their early architecture as the product of intense, rapid construction. Thousands of buildings erected by immigrant labor in a short time, using the wood and brick materials locally available. But photographs of these cities taken in the 1850s and 1860s, within years of their supposed founding, show something very different from what you would expect of rapidly constructed frontier settlements. The buildings are not rough or improvised. They are not the temporary wooden structures of a pioneer town. They are massive, elaborately ornamented, architecturally sophisticated structures that would have taken years to design and decades to build under conventional circumstances. They have elaborate cornices, intricate brickwork, high ceilings, large windows, and structural proportions that speak of professional architectural planning rather than frontier improvisation. More tellingly, many of these buildings show clear evidence of having been constructed in an environment that was subsequently flooded. Their lower floors are often described in historical records as having been converted to storage or abandoned, not because they were originally designed as storage, but because they became inaccessible after the ground level rose around them. In Seattle, the famous underground tour visits the original street level of the 1880 city, an entire subterranean world of sidewalks, storefronts, and passages that are now sealed below the current street. The official explanation is that Seattle's streets were deliberately raised after the Great Fire of 1889, an explanation that accounts for some of the grade change, but does not fully account for the existence of intact subterranean storefronts that were already below ground level before the fire. In Sacramento, the river city that served as California's gold rush capital, historical records describe periodic flooding so severe that the city eventually undertook a program of building and ground raising to elevate the entire downtown above flood level. The Tartarian researchers note that this explanation, if accepted at face value, implies that Sacramento was originally built at a level highly vulnerable to flooding, which raises the question of why it would have been built at that level in the first place by supposedly experienced and competent builders. Why would the founders of a city in a known flood zone build their structures at flood level rather than above it? The answer, from the Tartarian perspective, is that they didn't. The buildings were built at what was, at the time of their construction, the appropriate ground level, a level well above the floodplain. It was a subsequent catastrophic event, the mud flood, that raised the surrounding terrain to the point where the original buildings became flood vulnerable, and the subsequent street raising programs that the official record describes were responses not to a design flaw, but to a geological reality that nobody wanted to explain publicly. The Sacramento and Seattle examples are relatively well documented, but the mud flood hypothesis finds its most compelling physical evidence in the geological record itself, specifically in the layer of sediment that appears when the soil of many urban areas is analyzed to be surprisingly consistent, surprisingly recent, and surprisingly widespread. In cities across North America and Europe, when construction projects dig below the 19th century foundations of existing buildings, they frequently encounter what geologists call a disturbed layer, a stratum of mixed sediment that does not correspond to the natural geological sequence of the area. This layer contains a mixture of organic material, mineral sediment, and in some cases, cultural artifacts, fragments of ceramic, metal, glass, and other manufactured objects that are inconsistent with natural deposition. The presence of manufactured artifacts in a supposedly naturally deposited sediment layer implies that the sediment was deposited after and around existing structures, that it covered and partially buried things that people had made. The standard geological explanation for such disturbed layers in urban areas is anthropogenic, meaning caused by human activity. Cities are messy places. People dig, fill, build, demolish, rebuild. The soil record of an urban area inevitably becomes mixed and disrupted over time. But the Tartarian researchers point to specific characteristics of the buried layer that make the standard anthropogenic explanation inadequate. The layer is often very deep, not the thin disturbance layer expected from normal urban activity, but a thick stratum of deposited material covering very large areas. It is often remarkably uniform in composition over large geographic distances, suggesting a single depositional event rather than the accumulated result of diverse local activities. And it often contains not just manufactured fragments, but complete or near-complete manufactured objects in apparently pristine condition. Objects that were buried quickly before they could deteriorate, rather than gradually accumulating in a garbage-filled soil. Moreover, the Tartarian researchers note that the depth and character of this layer correlates strongly with the period they identify as the mud flood event, roughly 1815 to 1850. Below the layer, the archaeological record becomes sparse or absent. Above the layer, the historical record of the 19th century begins in earnest. It is as if, at a certain point in the first half of the 19th century, something wiped the slate clean, buried what came before, and left a fresh surface on which the post-flood world was built. One of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence in the mud flood debate is the orphan train phenomenon. Between approximately 1854 and 1929, a series of organizations, most notably the Children's Aid Society, founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, arranged for the transportation of hundreds of thousands of orphaned and homeless children from Eastern American cities to rural areas and frontier communities across the Midwest and West. The official historical account describes this as a well-intentioned, if imperfect, social welfare program, an attempt to address the crisis of urban child poverty by placing destitute children in farming families who needed labor and could provide a home. The Tartarian researchers accept the basic facts of the orphan train program. What they question is the source of the orphans. The official account attributes the explosion of orphan children in American cities in the mid-19th century to the normal social disruptions of industrialization and immigration. The Tartarian researchers propose a different explanation. The hundreds of thousands of orphaned children flooding into American cities in this period were the survivors of the mud flood catastrophe. Children who had lost their families in the event, who had wandered into urban areas, and who were then systematically dispersed across the country to be absorbed into the surviving population. If this is true, it has profound implications. It implies that the mud flood was not a regional event, but a catastrophe of sufficient scale to produce hundreds of thousands of orphaned children in a short period. It implies that the social welfare organizations established to handle these children were, at some level, aware of the true cause of the orphan crisis, that they were not simply responding to the gradual pressures of industrialization, but to a specific, catastrophic demographic event. And it implies that the dispersal of these children, the deliberate distribution of flood survivors across the country, was part of the process of erasing the memory of the event, absorbing the surviving witnesses into communities that had no direct experience of what had happened and that would have no particular reason to ask difficult questions about the origins of the children placed in their care. The orphan train hypothesis is, by its nature, difficult to verify directly. The records of the Children's Aid Society and similar organizations are extensive but imperfect. as one would expect of any large-scale social program operating in the 19th century. But the Tartarian researchers point to specific features of the historical record that they argue are more consistent with their explanation than with the official one. The timing is suggestive. The Orphan train program begins in 1854, precisely the period in which the mud flood is hypothesized to have been at or near its peak. The scale is extraordinary. An estimated 250,000 children were transported over the program's 75-year history, a number that represents a significant fraction of the total child population of the northeastern United States. And the institutional urgency with which the program was organized and executed. Within a year of the Children's Aid Society's founding, it was already operating at significant scale, suggests a response to an existing crisis rather than a gradual organizational response to a slowly developing social problem. Let us now step back from the specific evidence and consider the broader theoretical framework that the mud flood hypothesis implies. If there was a large-scale catastrophic event in the early to mid-19th century that buried portions of existing civilization under a layer of sediment, what caused it? The Tartarian researchers have proposed several possible mechanisms, and it is worth considering each of them. The first proposed mechanism is a comet or asteroid impact. Specifically, a cometary impact or airburst event that produced a massive deposition of ejecta material, triggered widespread fires, and caused atmospheric disruptions leading to catastrophic flooding. The 1810s were, by the historical record, a period of unusual atmospheric instability. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 caused what became known as the Year Without a Summer in 1816. A period of global temperature drops, crop failures, and widespread famine. But the Tartarian researchers argue that Tambora alone is insufficient to explain all of the disruptions visible in the historical record of this period. They point to the growing body of scientific research on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the argument that a comet or comet swarm struck the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago, causing a sudden climatic reversal and widespread civilizational disruption, and suggest that a smaller but still significant impact event in the early 19th century could have produced the effects they describe. The second proposed mechanism is a pole shift, a sudden or relatively rapid reorientation of the Earth's rotational axis, which would produce massive flooding, global seismic activity, and the kind of large-scale sediment deposition that the mud flood hypothesis describes. Pole shifts have been a subject of scientific debate for decades, with conventional geology generally rejecting sudden pole shifts in favor of very gradual, slow change. But a small but credible minority of geologists and geophysicists argues that the evidence for rapid pole shifts is stronger than the mainstream acknowledges, and the Tartarian researchers embrace this minority view as consistent with their overall framework. The third proposed mechanism is human, specifically warfare. The Tartarian researchers argue that the mud flood was not purely a natural event, but was, at least in part, deliberately caused. That the new power structure that sought to replace the Tartarian civilization possessed or developed weapons capable of producing the kind of catastrophic environmental effects that the mud flood represents. This is the most speculative of the three proposed mechanisms, and it is the one that shades most directly into what might be called deep conspiracy territory. But the researchers who advocate it point to specific historical evidence. The almost inexplicably rapid technological development of military capabilities in the early 19th century, the sudden and dramatic shifts in global power that occurred in this same period, and the existence of what some researchers claim are historical documents describing deliberate environmental warfare conducted by the forces that sought to end Tartarian civilization. Whatever its cause, the effect of the mud flood, if it occurred as the researchers describe, would have been profound and lasting. A large-scale catastrophic event in the early 19th century would have done several things simultaneously. It would have destroyed a significant portion of the existing population, particularly in the affected areas. It would have disrupted existing social structures, governance, commerce, communication, knowledge transmission, in ways that would have taken generations to recover from. It would have physically buried evidence of the pre-existing civilization, its buildings, its artifacts, its archives, and it would have created an opportunity for a new power structure to step into the vacuum, claim ownership of the surviving infrastructure, and construct a new historical narrative that attributed everything valuable in the landscape to its own agency, rather than to what came before. This is, the researchers argue, exactly what happened. And the evidence for the deliberate construction of this false narrative is, they claim, visible in the historical record of the institutions that were established in the aftermath of the event. Consider the founding of the Smithsonian Institution. Established by Act of Congress in 1846, the Smithsonian describes itself as the world's largest museum and research complex. It was founded with a bequest from James Smithson, a British scientist who left his estate to the United States for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. The Smithsonian became, almost immediately, the primary custodian of American historical memory, the institution charged with collecting, preserving, and interpreting the material evidence of American, and increasingly, world history. The Tartarian researchers focus particularly on the Smithsonian's documented history of artifact destruction and suppression, a history that is not entirely invented, since mainstream historians acknowledge that the Smithsonian, in its early decades, did indeed destroy or discard large numbers of artifacts that did not fit its developing interpretive frameworks. The most famous of these concerns the treatment of giant human skeletons. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, numerous newspaper accounts described the discovery of abnormally large human skeletal remains. Skeletons ranging from 7 to 12 feet in height, in burial mounds, excavations, and construction sites across North America. These discoveries were frequently reported in local newspapers and were known to the Smithsonian, which sent investigators to examine them. And then, in case after case, the skeletal remains disappeared, sent to the Smithsonian for analysis, and never displayed, never published in scientific literature, and according to the researchers, quietly destroyed. The official Smithsonian position is that no such giant skeletons ever existed, that the newspaper reports were exaggerations, hoaxes, or misidentifications of normal-sized skeletal remains. The Tartarian researchers note that this position is convenient to the point of suspicion, and that the pattern of discovery, transmission to official institutions, and subsequent disappearance is too consistent across too many independent reports to be entirely explained by hoax or misidentification. They argue that the giant skeletons were real, that they represented the physical remains of the Tartarian population, a population that may have been, on average, significantly taller than modern humans, and that their suppression was deliberate, aimed at removing physical evidence of a human type that did not fit the official narrative of human development. The giant skeleton question connects to another persistent theme in Tartarian research, the claim that the pre-flood humanity, or at least a portion of it, the Tartarian civilization specifically, was characterized by physical traits that differ significantly from what we consider normal today. The researchers cite historical accounts of unusually tall and physically imposing people in Central Asia and adjacent regions, consistent with the occasional modern discovery of elongated skull specimens or unusually large skeletal remains in areas corresponding to the historical Tartarian territory. They cite mythological traditions from cultures around the world that describe a race of giants, or people of unusual size and capability who lived in a previous age. And they cite the architectural evidence: buildings with ceilings 40, 50, 60 feet high, doorways 12 feet tall, furniture proportioned for inhabitants significantly larger than modern humans, as physical evidence of a population for whom this scale was not decorative excess, but functional necessity. This is, again, speculative. The mainstream explanations for tall ceilings, thermal regulation, acoustic properties, social signaling, are available and have merit, but the Tartarian researchers note that the consistency of the pattern, oversized architectural features appearing in buildings across the supposed Tartarian world, regardless of culture or period, is not easily explained by the standard accounts. Let us return, however, to the more solid evidential ground of the mud flood itself, and consider what the geological record says about the possibility of a large-scale sediment deposition event in the 19th century. Geological evidence for sudden, large-scale sediment deposition events is, by the standards of conventional geological understanding, unremarkable. The geological record is full of evidence for floods, mud flows, volcanic ash deposits, and other events that rapidly buried existing land surfaces under thick layers of sediment. What is normally assumed is that such events were prehistoric, that they occurred before significant human settlement, and therefore could not have affected an existing civilization. The uniformitarian principle that dominates mainstream geology holds that geological change is gradual and that sudden, catastrophic events are exceptional and historically distant. But this principle has come under significant challenge in recent decades. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, mentioned earlier, proposes that a major cosmic impact event, approximately 12,800 years ago, produced sudden and dramatic geological changes, including widespread flooding, fires, and sediment deposition, that contributed to the end of the Clovis culture in North America and to the extinction of numerous megafaunal species. This hypothesis, while still controversial, has gained growing acceptance among geologists and archaeologists over the past 2 decades, and has been supported by a series of papers in peer-reviewed journals describing physical evidence for a cosmic impact horizon at approximately the Younger Dryas boundary. If such an event occurred 12,800 years ago, the Tartarian researchers ask, why could not a similar, if smaller scale, event have occurred in the early 19th century? The mechanisms are available, the precedents are established, the physical evidence, the buried buildings, the uniform sediment layers, the Orphan crisis, the population disruptions, is consistent with such an event. Why does mainstream science reject this possibility? The answer, the researchers argue, is institutional and political rather than evidential. The geological and historical establishments have invested enormously in a specific account of human and civilizational history. That account places the beginning of significant human civilization approximately 5 to 10,000 years ago, traces the development of Western civilization through Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe, and arrives at the present day as the pinnacle of an unbroken, progressive development. An event in the 19th century that destroyed a more advanced civilization and allowed a less advanced power structure to seize control would overturn not just specific historical claims, but the entire foundational narrative of Western modernity. The story of progress, of rational enlightenment, of the civilizational superiority of the West. The institutions that benefit from this narrative, which is to say, virtually every major academic, governmental, and cultural institution in the Western world, have strong incentives to resist evidence that challenges it. This brings us to one of the most compelling and least discussed aspects of the mud flood hypothesis, the question of memory. How is it possible that such a catastrophic event, an event that buried buildings, produced hundreds of thousands of orphans, disrupted populations across an entire continent, and fundamentally altered the physical landscape of the world, could have been forgotten within a generation? The researchers have several answers. The first is that it was not entirely forgotten, that fragments of memory survive in exactly the places one would expect traumatic collective memory to survive. In folklore, in religious tradition, in the stories told by indigenous peoples, and in the coded symbolism of the surviving elite culture. The prevalence of flood narratives across virtually every human culture, from the biblical account of Noah, to the Sumerian story of Utnapishtim, to the Hindu tradition of Manu, to the Aztec legend of the fifth sun, is usually explained as a cultural memory of the natural flooding events that periodically disrupted early agricultural societies. The Tartarian researchers argue that these narratives reflect something more specific and more recent, a memory of the mud flood event of the early 19th century, preserved in the only forms available to a traumatized and dispersed population. story, and symbol. The second answer is more direct. The memory was actively suppressed, not spontaneously forgotten, but deliberately destroyed. The mechanisms of this suppression included the burning of libraries, the destruction of archives, the enforced adoption of a new historical curriculum in schools and universities, and the systematic marginalization and discrediting of anyone who maintained or claimed to maintain knowledge of the pre-flood civilization. The Tartarian researchers identify the mid-19th century as a period of intense institutionalization of knowledge, the founding of universities, museums, libraries, archives, scientific societies, and regulatory bodies. And they argue that this institutionalization was not simply a natural development of the Enlightenment intellectual tradition, but a deliberate project of historical control, aimed at establishing and enforcing a specific version of the past. The third answer concerns the physical form of the evidence. The most powerful evidence for what actually happened is architectural. The buildings themselves, which cannot lie about their age, their sophistication, or their physical relationship to the surrounding terrain. But for this evidence to be properly interpreted, you need to know what you're looking at. You need to know that a building with its lower floors below ground level is not a normal building on a raised street, but a building partially buried by a catastrophic event. You need to know that a building of extraordinary architectural sophistication in a supposedly recently settled city is not the product of rapid frontier construction, but of a much older tradition. Without this contextual knowledge, which the new historical narrative was specifically designed to prevent people from acquiring, the physical evidence of the mud flood is invisible. It is hiding in plain sight, unrecognized by the people who walk past it every day. There is one more dimension of the mud flood hypothesis that deserves careful attention before we move on, and it is perhaps the most disturbing dimension of all. It concerns the question of what happened to the people who were aware of the truth, who lived through the mud flood, who knew what the buildings around them actually were, who remembered the civilization that had been buried. The Tartarian researchers point to the extraordinary prevalence of what they call reset narratives in the historical record of the 19th century. Stories of communities, families, and individuals who had to be relocated, re-educated, and reintegrated into a new social order. The Orphan train program is the most dramatic example, but it is not the only one. The great waves of immigration from Europe to America in the mid to late 19th century, the forced relocation of indigenous peoples across North America, the establishment of boarding schools designed to strip indigenous children of their cultural memory. These are all, the researchers argue, aspects of a single, large-scale project of cultural erasure, aimed at replacing the memory of the old world with the requirements of the new one. The term Great Reset has acquired specific political connotations in the 21st century, but the Tartarian researchers use it in a historical sense to describe the managed transition from the pre-flood Tartarian world to the post-flood Western world order. This transition, they argue, was not spontaneous or gradual. It was planned and executed with deliberate speed by a specific power group, a group with the organizational capability to manage the physical reconstruction of the post-flood landscape, the cultural capability to construct and enforce a new historical narrative, and the political capability to suppress resistance and maintain the deception across generations. Who was this group? This is the question that we will begin to address in Part 3 and develop throughout the remainder of this documentary. For now, it is sufficient to note that the Tartarian researchers generally agree on certain characteristics of the post-flood power structure. It was global in reach, centralized in organization, and possessed of a specific agenda that required the erasure of Tartarian civilization as a precondition for its own legitimacy. The clues to its identity are, they argue, visible in the architecture it claimed as its own, in the institutions it founded, in the symbols it adopted, and in the specific aspects of Tartarian knowledge it worked hardest to suppress. In Part 3, we will turn to the architecture, the physical legacy of the Tartarian civilization that is hiding in plain sight across the world's cities. We will examine the specific features that identify a building as Tartarian, regardless of the supposed culture, period, or architect to whom it has been officially attributed. We will look at the astronomical alignments, the energetic geometries, the structural technologies that point to a civilization with a fundamentally different understanding of the physical world than we possess today. And we will begin to appreciate why this architecture was not demolished after the mud flood, why the new power structure chose to preserve and claim these buildings rather than destroy them, and what that choice tells us about the nature and purpose of the civilization that built them. The mud flood, if it occurred as the researchers describe, was not just a geological event. It was a civilizational rupture, a moment when one world ended and another began. The world that ended was older, larger, more capable, and more sophisticated than anything the official historical narrative acknowledges. The world that began was built, literally and figuratively, on top of it, inheriting its infrastructure while denying its existence. Understanding this rupture and the cover-up that followed it is the key to understanding the world we live in today. It is the key to understanding why our civilization, despite its apparent technological sophistication, seems unable to solve its most basic problems. It is the key to understanding why certain forms of knowledge, about energy, about health, about the nature of consciousness, seem perpetually just beyond our reach. And it is the key to understanding what was lost in the mud flood, and what it would mean to recover it. The architecture of the gods. The architecture of the supposed Tartarian civilization is everywhere. It is the buildings we call our most important. Our capitol buildings, our national museums, our great train stations, our cathedrals, our universities, our palaces of justice. It is the architecture of authority and permanence, of civilization at its most confident and most capable. And it is, the Tartarian researchers argue, not ours. We didn't build it, we inherited it. And in inheriting it, we claimed it, fitted it with retrospective plaques and false founding narratives, and the names of architects who may never have seen the buildings they were credited with designing. The architectural argument for Tartarian civilization rests on several interlocking observations. Let us go through them systematically, because the cumulative weight of these observations is, we believe, significant. The first observation is global consistency. In the field of architectural history, the study of building traditions is inevitably the study of local conditions, local materials, local climates, local cultural traditions, local technical capabilities. Different societies build in different ways because they have different resources, different needs, different beliefs, and different accumulated knowledge. This is why a vernacular farmhouse in England looks nothing like a vernacular farmhouse in Japan. The differences reflect real differences in culture, climate, material availability, and technical tradition. And yet, when we look at the architecture that the Tartarian researchers identify as Tartarian, the grand civic buildings, the great domed structures, the elaborate ornamented facades, we find a remarkable consistency that transcends geography, climate, and supposed cultural difference. The main station of the city of Mumbai, built, according to official history, by the British colonial administration in the 1880s, shares specific architectural features with the main station of the city of Cincinnati, built according to official history by American designers in the 1930s, which shares features with the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, built according to official history by Russian designers in the 1810s, which shares features with the Union Station in Washington, D.C., built according to official history in the early 20th century. These buildings are not identical. They are not copies of each other, but they share a vocabulary, the same proportional relationships, the same ornamental motifs, the same structural solutions, the same relationship between dome and tower and arcade. They feel, when you look at them side by side, as if they came from the same source, as if they were designed by people who shared a common architectural education, a common set of principles, and a common understanding of what buildings were supposed to do. The conventional explanation for this global consistency is the history of architectural influence. European architectural traditions, primarily derived from classical Greek and Roman models, spread around the world as a result of European colonialism and cultural prestige. The fact that a building in Mumbai looks like a building in Cincinnati, looks like a building in St. Petersburg, is, in this account, simply a reflection of the global spread of European, specifically Greco-Roman, architectural taste. Different societies, at different times, adopted European architectural models because European civilization was the globally dominant one, and its aesthetic standards were, for better or worse, the internationally recognized standards of building quality. This explanation has some validity. The history of architectural influence is real and well documented, but the Tartarian researchers argue that it is not sufficient to explain what we actually see, for several reasons. First, the spread of European architectural influence through colonialism would have produced copies of European buildings, more or less faithful reproductions of European models in non-European contexts. But what we actually see in the buildings identified as Tartarian is something more specific than generic European neoclassicism. We see the same proportional relationships, the same specific ornamental details, the same structural features that are not, in fact, derived from the buildings of ancient Greece and Rome that supposedly inspired them, but that represent a distinct tradition of their own. The Parthenon in Athens and the Colosseum in Rome do not look like the buildings we are discussing. They share broad stylistic vocabulary, columns, arches, triangular pediments, but the specific character of the supposed Tartarian buildings is different. It is larger, more complex, more elaborately ornamented, and structurally more ambitious than anything ancient Greece or Rome actually produced. Second, the timing of the supposed spread of European architectural influence does not match the evidence. If the grand civic buildings of the world are the product of European neoclassical influence spreading through colonialism, they should appear in non-European contexts relatively late, after European colonialism established itself, after local architects were trained in European traditions, after local building industries developed the capacity to execute European-style designs. But in many cases, the buildings we are discussing appear earlier than this timeline allows, in cities that were supposedly just being founded, in territories that supposedly had no contact with European architectural tradition. The grand buildings of San Francisco in the 1850s photographs, the elaborate civic architecture of Chicago in the 1860s photographs, these appear too early, too complete, and too sophisticated to be the product of a European architectural tradition that was itself still developing. Third, and most importantly, several features of the architecture identified as Tartarian cannot be derived from the neoclassical tradition at all, because they are functionally specific in ways that the neoclassical tradition has no framework to explain. These are the features that the Tartarian researchers most specifically focus on: the domes, the towers, the specific geometric proportions that they argue were not purely aesthetic choices, but functional engineering decisions rooted in an understanding of physics, of electromagnetic energy, of the resonant properties of matter, that is significantly more sophisticated than anything officially attributed to the 19th century. Let us focus on the dome. The dome is perhaps the single most consistent feature of the architecture identified as Tartarian. It appears on buildings of every supposed type and in every supposed culture, on churches, on government buildings, on train stations, on market halls, on academic buildings, on hospitals. It appears in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas. It appears in buildings supposedly constructed across a span of more than 500 years, attributed to architects from dozens of different national and cultural traditions. Its prevalence is so remarkable that mainstream architectural history has had to construct an entire subfield, the history of dome construction, to account for it. And the official history of dome construction is a fascinating exercise in what might be called architectural historiography, the writing of a coherent story about why so many different people in so many different places and times chose to build the same structural form. The official story says that domes were a structural response to the problem of roofing large interior spaces without intermediate supports. That by using curved forms, the outward thrust of gravity could be redirected and managed in a way that allowed large, column-free interior spaces. This is technically true. Domes are structurally efficient ways of covering large spaces. But this technical explanation doesn't account for the specific dimensions, proportions, and materials of actual domes. It doesn't explain why domes appear on buildings that don't need large, column-free interior spaces, small chapels, private residences, decorative garden structures. It doesn't explain why the specific proportional relationship between dome diameter and dome height remains remarkably consistent across supposed different traditions and periods. And it doesn't explain why the dome is so consistently associated with other specific architectural features: the drum, the lantern, the surrounding towers, the specific ground floor plan, that together constitute what the Tartarian researchers argue is a functional technology rather than a purely architectural form. The functional technology in question is electromagnetic energy collection and distribution. This is the claim that provokes the most vigorous rejection from mainstream physicists and engineers. But it is also, the researchers argue, the one that best explains the specific and consistent features of the architectural tradition they are examining. The argument goes as follows. The Earth has a natural electromagnetic field. This is not controversial. It is basic physics. The Earth also has a natural radio frequency resonance, established by the space between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, known as the Schumann resonances. Also basic physics, first formally described in the 1950s, but the phenomenon itself is not new. These electromagnetic properties of the Earth can, in principle, be tapped and used to provide power without combustion, without burning anything. The possibility of extracting usable energy from the Earth's electromagnetic field was the central goal of Nikola Tesla's later career, and his famous Wardenclyffe Tower project was specifically designed to test the feasibility of this approach. Tesla believed, based on his own experiments, that it was possible to transmit electrical power wirelessly across the entire globe using the Earth's natural electromagnetic resonance. He was denied funding for this project, officially because it was not commercially viable, which is to say because it would not have allowed the new energy companies being established by J.P. Morgan and others to charge for the energy they provided. The Tartarian researchers argue that Tesla was not inventing a new technology. He was recovering an old one. The domes, towers, and specific geometric features of the architecture they identify as Tartarian were, in this argument, the physical infrastructure of a global electromagnetic energy distribution network. A network that collected the natural electromagnetic energy of the Earth and atmosphere, amplified it, and distributed it through the conductive materials in the buildings and the ground. The specific dimensions of domes, their diameter, height, and thickness, were determined not by aesthetics or structural necessity, but by the need to resonate at specific electromagnetic frequencies. The towers were antennae. The spires and pinnacles were discharge points. The elaborate geometric ornamental patterns were not decorative but functional. They were the physical expression of mathematical relationships that optimize electromagnetic resonance in specific materials and geometric forms. This claim is, obviously, extraordinary, and we want to be clear that it cannot be verified from the physical evidence of the buildings alone, not without the technical knowledge and instrumentation required to measure the electromagnetic properties of specific structures, which is something that, to our knowledge, no controlled scientific study has yet attempted. What we can say is that the claim is not self-evidently absurd. The electromagnetic properties of building materials and forms are real and measurable. Buildings do interact with electromagnetic fields. The specific shapes and materials of large stone and brick structures do affect the local electromagnetic environment. Whether these effects were deliberately designed into the supposedly Tartarian buildings, and whether they constituted a functional energy distribution system, is a question that deserves serious scientific investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. What we can say more confidently is that the architectural record is consistent with this hypothesis, in ways that the conventional account is not. The specific features that the Tartarian researchers identify as electromagnetically functional, the domes of specific proportions, the towers with specific height-to-base ratios, the ground floor plans with specific geometric relationships to cardinal directions, are exactly the features that appear consistently across the global architectural tradition they are examining. If these features were purely aesthetic, we would expect much greater variation, much more individual and cultural expression, much less global consistency. The fact that these specific features appear so consistently across so many supposed different traditions is more consistent with a functional explanation than with an aesthetic one. Let us take one specific example to ground this discussion in concrete architectural reality. Consider the main building of the Union Station in Washington, D.C., built, according to official history, between 1903 and 1908, designed by the architect Daniel Burnham. It is a magnificent building, enormous, domed, elaborately ornamented in a style that draws on both classical Roman and Beaux-Arts French architectural traditions. Its main hall has a coffered barrel vault 130 feet high, covering a space 300 feet long and 130 feet wide. The detailed ornamental work on its facade includes eagles, shields, Roman centurions, and elaborate geometric patterns in stone. The official history of Union Station is detailed, and on its face, convincing. Burnham was a real architect, one of the most important in American history, responsible for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, that is itself a major focus of Tartarian research. The construction of Union Station is documented in contemporary newspapers, architectural journals, and government records. Its cost, approximately $125 million in today's money, while substantial, is not obviously beyond the capacity of the federal government of the early 20th century. But the Tartarian researchers look at Union Station and notice things the official history doesn't explain. They note that the proportions of its main vault match, to within a few percent, the proportions of the great vaulted spaces in buildings from Russia, India, and Central Asia that predate the supposed influence of classical Rome on American architecture by centuries. They note that specific ornamental patterns on its facade appear in nearly identical form on buildings in Uzbekistan and China that have no documented architectural connection to American neoclassicism. They note that the station's orientation and siting, its relationship to the surrounding landscape, its alignment to specific compass directions, is consistent with the energetic design principles they identify in other supposedly Tartarian structures. And they note that certain features of the building's substructure, portions of the foundation that are now inaccessible, are inconsistent with early 20th century construction technology and suggest the presence of an earlier structure on or below the site. Are these observations conclusive? No. Are they consistent with a broader pattern that, taken in total, strongly suggests a pre-existing architectural tradition? The researchers argue yes, and they argue that the burden of proof should not be entirely on those who see the anomalies, but should also fall on those who maintain the official story, who should be required to explain, in specific and technical terms, how the specific features they are claiming as distinctive are satisfactorily accounted for by the conventional history. No discussion of supposed Tartarian architecture would be complete without attention to one of the most remarkable and yet least discussed categories of historical construction: the star fort, also known as Trace Italienne or bastion fortifications. Star forts are a specific form of defensive fortification characterized by a characteristic star-shaped plan with projecting triangular bastions arranged around a central defensive core. They appear in the historical record beginning in the 15th century, officially attributed to Italian Renaissance military engineers who developed the form as a response to the increasing prevalence of artillery in medieval warfare. The conventional explanation for star forts is straightforward. Artillery had made the tall vertical walls of medieval castles obsolete, since a cannonball could easily demolish such walls. The solution was to build fortifications that were low and thick, with angled surfaces that would deflect cannonballs rather than absorb them, and with the characteristic projecting bastions that eliminated the dead zones that traditional castle walls created for defenders. This explanation is technically coherent and is generally accepted in mainstream military history. But the Tartarian researchers noticed several things about star forts that the conventional explanation struggles with. The first is their extraordinary prevalence. Star forts appear not just in Europe, where artillery warfare made them a practical necessity, but all over the world. In North America, South America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Many of these non-European star forts predate European contact with the regions where they are found, or at least predate the introduction of artillery to those regions. Why would a fortification specifically developed as a response to European artillery warfare appear in places where neither European influence nor artillery warfare had yet penetrated? The second anomaly is their scale and complexity. Many star forts are works of extraordinary engineering, massive earthworks covering hundreds of acres, precisely geometrically planned, requiring enormous labor to construct. The largest ones would have taken decades to build, even with modern earth-moving equipment. The official accounts of their construction routinely attribute them to relatively brief construction periods using hand labor, periods that seem, when calculated, wholly inadequate to the actual task. The third anomaly is what the researchers identify as the energetic properties of the star form itself. The specific geometry of the star fort, the precisely equilateral triangular bastions, the specific angular relationships between bastions and central core, the characteristic proportions of the whole, creates a form that is, in electromagnetic terms, a particularly effective resonator. The Tartarian researchers argue that star forts were not primarily military structures at all. They were energy collection and distribution facilities. Their star shape specifically designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field in ways that concentrated and amplified energetic output. The military use attributed to them in official history was either secondary or entirely retrospective, applied to a form that already existed for other purposes. This claim will strike many viewers as extraordinary. Star forts as energy facilities rather than military fortifications? The idea seems impossible to reconcile with the massive earthen walls, the cannon emplacements, the drawbridges and moats that characterize these structures. But the researchers make a specific point in response to this objection. The military features of star forts, the cannon emplacements, the moats, the gates, were not original to the structures, but were added later by the new power order that inherited them. The underlying form, the star shape, the specific geometric plan, is original Tartarian construction, repurposed and modified for military use by the people who came after. Just as the buildings of a previous civilization were claimed as new construction, the energy facilities of the previous civilization were claimed and repurposed as military installations. Whether or not this specific argument is correct, it points to a broader principle that runs through all of the Tartarian architectural research, the principle of repurposing. The researchers argue consistently that the new power order that emerged after the mud flood did not build from scratch. It could not. It lacked the technology, the knowledge, and the organizational capability to replicate the constructions of the Tartarian civilization. Instead, it repurposed. It took existing structures and applied new functions, new decorations, new historical narratives to them. The great domed buildings became churches, government buildings, railway stations. The star forts became military fortifications. The city grids and street plans of the pre-flood cities became the organizational frameworks of the new cities built on top of them. In each case, the underlying reality that these structures were Tartarian in origin was obscured by the overlay of new designation and new narrative. Let us spend the final section of Part 3 considering one of the most powerful pieces of architectural evidence in the Tartarian researchers' arsenal, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, commonly known as the White City. The World's Columbian Exposition was officially held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. It occupied approximately 690 acres along the Lake Michigan waterfront in Chicago, and it attracted over 27 million visitors during its 6-month run, a number equivalent to approximately 40% of the total population of the United States at the time. It featured hundreds of buildings, most of them designed in the Beaux-Arts neoclassical style and painted white, hence the popular name, White City. It was the largest gathering of human beings for a single event in history up to that point. The official history of the White City presents it as one of the greatest achievements of American architecture and urban planning, a demonstration of the United States' cultural and technical maturity, its arrival as a genuine world civilization. The buildings were designed by some of the most celebrated architects of the era, including Daniel Burnham, who served as director of works. They were built in a remarkably short time, approximately 2 years, by an army of immigrant laborers working at a then unprecedented pace. And they were, by almost any measure, extraordinarily impressive. Massive, elaborately ornamented structures of a scale and complexity that astonished even their contemporaries. The Tartarian researchers look at the White City and see something entirely different from what the official history describes. They see a display, not of American construction capability, but of an existing architectural tradition that the event's organizers wanted to present to the world as American achievement. They argue that the buildings of the White City were not built for the exposition. They were already there, or at least the structures were already there, built by the pre-flood Tartarian civilization, and the exposition was organized around them, a dramatic public staging of the new order's claim to have created what it had actually inherited. This argument is supported, the researchers say, by several specific features of the historical record. First, the construction timeline. The White City buildings were supposedly designed and built between 1891 and 1893, 2 years for hundreds of buildings covering hundreds of acres, including structures of extraordinary scale and complexity. By the standards of any era of construction, this timeline is extraordinary. By the standards of 1891 technology, the researchers argue, it was impossible, unless the structures were already there. Second, the photographic record. Photographs of the exposition grounds taken during and after the event show specific architectural features that are inconsistent with temporary construction. The type of building you would erect for a 6-month event and then demolish. The foundations are massive, built for permanence. The interior spaces are large and elaborately finished in ways that have no practical purpose for a temporary exhibition space. Certain buildings show evidence, in photographs taken during the demolition that followed the exposition, of existing substructure that predates the exposition construction. Foundations and lower floors that are clearly not part of the temporary exposition buildings, but of something older. Third, the fire. After the exposition closed, most of the buildings were destroyed by a series of fires. Fires that the official history attributes to a combination of deliberate demolition and accidental combustion. The Tartarian researchers argue that the fires were deliberately set, not to demolish temporary structures, but to destroy evidence of the pre-existing Tartarian buildings that the exposition had used, and that could not be allowed to survive as testimony to the true origin of the supposed White City. The demolition of the White City is, in the Tartarian framework, a microcosm of the larger project of civilizational erasure, a specific, local act of deliberate destruction aimed at eliminating physical evidence of the pre-flood civilization and enforcing the narrative that all the grandeur of the present order was the product of the present order's own efforts, rather than the inheritance of something older and greater. The architectural evidence for the Tartarian civilization is, of all the evidence categories the researchers examined, perhaps the most viscerally compelling, because it is the most literally present. You can walk into a supposedly 19th century government building and look up at a dome 150 feet above your head and ask yourself, with complete sincerity, how was this built? Not how does the official history say it was built, but how, physically, practically, logistically, was this built? By whom? With what tools? In what time? Funded by whom? Organized how? The official answers to these questions are often thin: a name, a date, a vague reference to immigrant labor and public funds. The Tartarian researchers argue that the thinness of these official answers is itself evidence that the narrative was constructed after the fact, without detailed documentation, because the actual history was something that could not be allowed into the record. And they argue that the buildings themselves, permanent, physical, impossible to unmake, are the most reliable evidence of all. The buildings don't lie. The buildings are what the buildings are. And what they are, the researchers conclude, is ancient, built by a civilization that mastered energy, geometry, and materials in ways we are only beginning to understand. The World's Fairs and the Stolen Past. The official history of the World's Fairs presents them as what they claim to be: celebrations of progress, of industrial innovation, of Western civilization's confident advance. They were exhibitions of the new technologies, new products, new ideas about urban design and social organization. They were, in this account, forward-looking events, demonstrations of what the future would hold. The Tartarian researchers present a very different reading. They argue that the World's Fairs were backward-looking, specifically that they were retrospective displays of a pre-existing architectural and technological tradition, presented to mass audiences as new construction, in order to establish in the public mind a false narrative about the origins of the built environment they inhabited. The magnificent buildings of the World's Fairs were not new. They were old. And the fairs were, in this reading, a key mechanism by which the post-flood power structure trained the public to see inherited Tartarian buildings as products of its own creative and technical genius. The case begins with the Crystal Palace. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in Hyde Park in London, was organized around a remarkable building, an enormous prefabricated glass and iron structure, the Crystal Palace, designed by Joseph Paxton and erected in the extraordinary time of approximately 6 months. The Crystal Palace covered roughly 92,000 square meters and was large enough to contain full-grown elm trees that had previously occupied the Hyde Park site. It housed over 14,000 exhibitors and attracted more than 6 million visitors. The official history of the Crystal Palace focuses on its innovative prefabricated construction. It was one of the first large buildings to be constructed from standardized, factory-produced components, assembled on site in a revolutionary new way that prefigured the mass production principles of the 20th century. Paxton, who had previously designed large glass greenhouse structures for the Duke of Devonshire, applied the same principles to a dramatically larger scale and produced a building that was, by the standards of 1851, genuinely novel. The Tartarian researchers do not primarily dispute the novelty of the Crystal Palace's construction method. What they dispute is the context in which it was placed, the contents of the exhibition it housed. Because the exhibits at the Great Exhibition were not primarily new inventions or new products, they were existing things, the full range of what had been manufactured, crafted, and created in the preceding decades and centuries, presented for display, comparison, and commercial promotion. And among the things displayed were numerous objects, technologies, and materials that, the researchers argue, reveal a technological sophistication that is inconsistent with the official timeline of industrial development. Specifically, they point to exhibits of hydraulic technology, pneumatic systems, precision measurement tools, medical instruments, and communication devices that appear, when studied in detail, to represent not the products of recent industrial innovation, but the remnants of an older technological tradition, simplified perhaps, or partially understood, but clearly derived from a base of knowledge more sophisticated than the official Industrial Revolution account allows. They argue that the Crystal Palace was, among other things, a public inventory of surviving Tartarian technology, a systematic display of what remained after the mud flood, organized and presented by the new power order as the product of its own industrial ingenuity. The World's Fair argument becomes much stronger when we look at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. in the context of what was happening to the city of Chicago at the same time. Chicago in 1893 was a young city, officially founded as a town in 1833, incorporated as a city in 1837, and still in the process of rapid physical expansion in the 1890s. It had been devastated by the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed a large portion of its central business district. The city had subsequently rebuilt, spectacularly, in what mainstream history celebrates as one of the greatest feats of urban reconstruction in history. The Chicago School of Architecture that emerged in the post-fire period is credited with inventing the modern skyscraper and establishing the principles of steel frame construction that define urban architecture to this day. And yet, photographs of Chicago taken in the 1850s and 1860s, before the fire, when the city was barely 20 years old, show a city of extraordinary architectural sophistication. Buildings in the Loop District that cannot, by any reasonable account, have been built in the 20 years since the city's official founding. Buildings with elaborate stone carvings, with neoclassical facades, with structural proportions suggesting decades of skilled construction labor. Buildings that look, in short, like they belong to a European city of 200 years standing, not to a frontier American city of 2 decades. The standard explanation for this apparent anachronism is the rapid importation of architectural skill and building materials. That Chicago's commercial success in the 1850s attracted skilled immigrant craftsmen from Europe and enabled the purchase of high-quality building materials from distant sources, producing a more sophisticated built environment more quickly than might otherwise be expected. This explanation has some merit. Chicago was indeed a commercial success in the 1850s, attracting capital and skilled labor. But the Tartarian researchers argue that the scale and sophistication of what appears in pre-fire Chicago photographs exceeds anything that can be explained by rapid commercial development alone. They argue that a significant portion of the built environment visible in those photographs predates Chicago's official founding. That when the city's founders arrived in the 1830s, they found not empty prairie, but a landscape that already contained significant built infrastructure, which they settled into, claimed, and built around. The Great Chicago Fire, in this reading, takes on a different significance. It was not an accident, or not merely an accident. It was an act of destruction aimed at eliminating the pre-existing built evidence that contradicted the official founding narrative. The old buildings, the ones that predated Chicago's official founding, that bore witness to the Tartarian civilization that had built them, were destroyed in the fire, along with the records and documents that might have supported a more accurate historical account. The new Chicago that rose from the ashes was genuinely new, genuinely the product of post-flood construction, and it was built on a clean slate that allowed the new narrative to proceed without contradiction from the physical evidence around it. The fire hypothesis. The idea that significant fires in major cities in the 19th century were deliberately set to destroy architectural evidence of the pre-flood civilization is one of the more dramatic claims in the Tartarian research framework, and it is, obviously, impossible to prove in any specific case. But it is worth noting that the 19th century is a period of extraordinary urban conflagration. London's Great Fire occurred in 1666, at the edge of the relevant period, but noted by researchers. Moscow burned in 1812. New York had major fires in 1835 and 1845. Chicago in 1871. Boston in 1872. San Francisco in 1906, associated with the earthquake, and Baltimore in 1904. The Tartarian researchers argue that the frequency and specific timing of these fires, each of which destroyed large portions of the built environment of cities that were experiencing rapid growth under the new post-flood order, is too consistent to be purely coincidental. More speculative, but more interesting, is the pattern of what was destroyed and what survived in each fire. In Chicago, the residential areas south of the Loop were largely spared, while the commercial and institutional core was heavily damaged. In Moscow, the fire was reportedly set deliberately by Russian forces to deny Napoleon's army the use of the city's supplies and shelter, a claim that, if accepted, turns the Moscow fire from a random catastrophe into a deliberate act. In each case, the Tartarian researchers examine the specific geography of destruction and survival, looking for patterns that might indicate selective burning rather than random conflagration. They are not the only people to have noticed anomalies in the 19th century fire record. Mainstream historians have long puzzled over the speed with which these fires spread, the specific patterns of destruction they left, and the difficulties that supposedly professional firefighting organizations encountered in containing them. But mainstream historians attribute these anomalies to the limitations of 19th century firefighting technology and the density of wooden construction in urban areas. Explanations that are technically plausible, but that do not fully resolve all of the specific oddities the researchers identify. Let us return to the World's Fairs and the broader role they played in the construction of the post-flood historical narrative. Because beyond the specific question of whether the buildings displayed at World's Fairs were new or old, there is a larger question about what the fairs were for, what purpose they served in the cultural and political ecology of the late 19th century. The World's Fairs were, among other things, machines for producing consent. They gathered enormous numbers of people, tens of millions in the case of the largest events, and exposed them to a specific vision of civilization: organized, progressive, rational, technologically capable, and European in its cultural orientation. They presented a world in which the industrial West was at the center and everything else was peripheral, exotic, or primitive. They staged, in enormous and spectacular physical form, the ideology of progress. The idea that history was a story of continuous improvement, from primitive past to sophisticated present, from darkness to light, from superstition to science. This ideology of progress had specific implications for how the past was to be understood. A world that was perpetually improving had no room for a prior civilization that was more sophisticated than the present one. A history that moved from primitive to advanced could not accommodate the idea of a reset, of a moment when an advanced civilization was destroyed and replaced by a less advanced one. The ideology of progress was not just an optimistic story about the future. It was a specific instruction about how the past was to be read, and a specific prohibition on the kinds of historical questions that might challenge the story's coherence. The World's Fairs were the most spectacular performances of this ideology. They were not exhibitions of historical truth. They were performances of historical identity, exercises in which the Western, industrial, post-flood civilization asserted its right to be considered the pinnacle of human achievement, the culmination of human history, the rightful heir to all that had been built before. And in doing so, they not only promoted a false narrative about the origins of the civilization's built environment, they trained the public to accept that narrative as obvious, to look at a magnificent domed building and think, "We built that," rather than, "Someone built that before us, and we claimed it." The educational function of the World's Fairs extended beyond the events themselves. The physical artifacts of the fairs, photographs, illustrated catalogs, souvenir booklets, educational materials, were distributed to schools and libraries across the country and around the world. The architectural vocabulary of the fairs became the standard visual language of authority and civilization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The buildings of the World's Fairs were copied, or rather, the style of the buildings was copied, in the construction of courthouses, post offices, libraries, and schools across America and Europe. When a small American city wanted to build a new municipal building in 1900, it hired an architect who had studied the Chicago Exposition's architecture and produced a local version of that vocabulary. The Exposition style became the civic style, the visual language of legitimate governmental authority. And in this way, the false narrative embedded in the World's Fairs propagated itself outward, replicating across the physical landscape of the early 20th century in the form of thousands of supposedly new buildings that wore the architectural costume of the Tartarian tradition while claiming it as their own invention. Beyond the world's fairs, the Tartarian researchers identify a cluster of institutional developments in the mid to late 19th century that they argue were specifically designed to establish and enforce the new historical narrative. These developments include the systematic organization of academic disciplines, particularly history, archaeology, and geology, along lines that supported the official account, the founding of major museums and archives, and the establishment of educational curricula that instilled the approved version of the past in successive generations of school children. The founding of the American historical profession is particularly instructive. The American Historical Association was established in 1884, at precisely the moment when the post-flood power structure was consolidating its narrative control. It was founded by and for academics, credentialed scholars at established universities, and it established professional standards for historical writing that, among other things, privileged documentary evidence over physical and material evidence. This privileging was not neutral. It was specifically advantageous to a historical narrative that was largely a textual construction that existed in documents, official records, and published histories, and specifically disadvantageous to a competing narrative whose evidence was primarily physical, buildings, artifacts, geological strata. By establishing documentary evidence as the gold standard of historical knowledge, the new historical profession effectively wrote the most damaging testimony against itself out of the evidentiary record. Physical evidence that contradicted the official narrative could be dismissed as misinterpreted, or could be reinterpreted within the official framework in a way that documentary evidence, properly controlled, properly authenticated, properly institutionally sanctioned, could not be so easily dismissed. The physical buildings were real, the buried foundations were real, but without documentary support, without official records describing their construction, attributing them to approved historical actors, placing them within the approved timeline, they could not, within the professional standards of the new historical discipline, be allowed to tell their own story. The Tartarian researchers argue that this epistemological choice, the privileging of document over object, was not an innocent methodological preference, but a deliberate strategic decision that served specific interests. It was one of several institutional mechanisms by which the post-flood power structure insulated its narrative from the most dangerous evidence against it. The establishment of professional archaeology as the discipline in the second half of the 19th century tells a similar story. The early decades of what we might call the proto-archaeological tradition, the period from roughly 1800 to 1860, were characterized by an extraordinary breadth of inquiry and a relative openness to findings that didn't fit conventional expectations. This was the era of the great amateur antiquarians, the curious gentlemen scholars who dug into mounds and ancient sites out of pure interest and published their findings without professional gatekeeping. Their records are full of anomalous discoveries, human remains of unusual size, artifacts of unexpected sophistication, architectural features that predated the supposed arrival of civilization in their areas. As professional archaeology established itself in the second half of the 19th century, institutionally affiliated, academically credentialed, editorially controlled, this breadth of inquiry narrowed dramatically. Professional archaeology developed specific frameworks for interpreting the past, derived from the documentary history that was being simultaneously established by professional historians, and discoveries that fell outside these frameworks were increasingly ignored, reinterpreted, or suppressed. The giant skeletons, the anomalous artifacts, the unexpected architectural features, these didn't disappear from the physical record, but they disappeared from the official interpretive record, dismissed as hoaxes, misidentifications, or simply not published by the journals that controlled professional communication. The result, the Tartarian researchers argue, was a discipline that was extraordinarily good at finding evidence for the approved narrative, evidence for the slow, progressive development of human civilization from primitive to advanced, from isolated to interconnected, from local to global, and that had structural mechanisms built into its professional norms and institutions, for not finding evidence that contradicted this narrative. Not through deliberate dishonesty by individual practitioners, most of whom were and are sincere scholars, but through the cumulative effect of institutional incentives that rewarded conformity to the approved framework and penalized challenges to it. The Smithsonian Institution, which we touched on briefly in Part 2, deserves more extended treatment here. The Smithsonian was founded in 1846 with a mandate of the increase and diffusion of knowledge, a mandate that it has pursued with great institutional energy and considerable public visibility. It is the world's largest museum and research complex, with 19 museums, 21 libraries, 9 research centers, and a collection of approximately 155 million items. The Smithsonian's founding coincides almost exactly with the period the Tartarian researchers identify as the critical phase of historical narrative construction, the late 1840s through the 1860s, when the post-flood power structure was establishing the institutions and professional disciplines that would control the official version of the past. And the Smithsonian's specific history contains several features that the researchers find highly suggestive. The first is the unusual circumstances of James Smithson's bequest. Smithson was a British chemist of illegitimate birth, the son of the Duke of Northumberland, who had no known connection to the United States and had never visited the country. His decision to leave his considerable estate to the United States government for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men was, and remains, inexplicable within the official historical framework. Why would a British scientist of that era leave his entire estate to the government of a country he had never visited? Various theories have been advanced, some involving his political radicalism, some his Freemasonic connections, some his desire to spite the British establishment that had denied him legitimacy. None of these theories is wholly convincing. The Tartarian researchers propose a different explanation, that Smithson was part of a specific organizational network, an international network with specific knowledge control objectives, and that his bequest was not a personal, philanthropic gesture, but an institutionally directed act, aimed at establishing a specific kind of knowledge institution in the specific territory that was, in the 1840s, the most rapidly expanding and most narratively malleable country in the world. The second feature of Smithsonian history that the researchers find significant is the documented history of artifact destruction and suppression. The early decades of the Smithsonian's existence were marked by what can only be described as aggressive collecting. The systematic acquisition of archaeological and anthropological materials from across North America, particularly from the mound-building cultures of the Midwest and Southeast. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, established in 1879, conducted numerous large-scale excavations of indigenous archaeological sites and acquired materials that, in many cases, contradicted the approved narrative of North American prehistory. Specific cases of anomalous finds in early Smithsonian collecting have been documented by independent researchers. Giant human skeletal remains, artifacts of unexpected metallurgical sophistication, evidence of large-scale agricultural and urban development inconsistent with the approved hunter-gatherer narrative of pre-Columbian North America. In case after case, these materials were taken to the Smithsonian, apparently examined, and then disappeared. Not transferred to other institutions, not placed in storage and available for later examination, simply gone. The Smithsonian's official position, when pressed on specific cases, is that no such materials were ever received, or that they were received and determined to be misidentified, or that the records for the relevant period are incomplete. The researchers find these responses collectively incredible. The claim that hundreds of reported anomalous finds, from dozens of independent locations, over a period of decades, all turned out to be either misidentifications or lost through administrative oversight, is not consistent with the systematic way in which the early Smithsonian managed its collections. It is more consistent with a deliberate program of material suppression.
The case for deliberate historical suppression is, we want to emphasize, not a case for a simple, centrally directed conspiracy. The researchers do not claim that there was a single mastermind issuing orders to a disciplined global network of operatives. What they claim is something more diffuse, and in some ways, more disturbing. A self-reinforcing institutional system in which the interests of the post-flood power structure were served by the collective behavior of thousands of institutions and millions of individuals who were not, for the most part, consciously aware of the larger project they were participating in. Universities hired professors who trained in the approved frameworks. Archaeological societies published findings that fit the approved narrative and declined findings that did not. Museums acquired and displayed materials that supported the official story and quietly disposed of materials that contradicted it. Textbook publishers produced educational materials that instilled the approved history in successive generations of school children. Newspaper editors, and later, broadcast media editors, applied the same filtering logic. The officially sanctioned story was credible. The anomalous findings were incredible. The system was not directed by a single controlling intelligence. It was maintained by the logic of institutional self-preservation, the tendency of all institutions to defend the narrative frameworks on which their authority rests, and to marginalize or suppress evidence that threatens those frameworks. This is not unique to the Tartarian question. It is a feature of all established knowledge traditions. The medical establishment's resistance to paradigm-changing findings, the economic establishment's dismissal of heterodox models, the political establishment's suppression of evidence challenging its legitimacy. The Tartarian researchers argue simply that in the case of the post-flood power structure, the stakes are higher and the suppression more thorough, because what is being suppressed is not just an inconvenient data point, but the entire foundation on which the current order's claims to legitimacy rest. If the buildings of the world's great cities were not built by the civilization that claims them, then that civilization's claims to cultural and civilizational superiority are fraudulent. If the technology that modern civilization is based on is a derivative and diminished version of a suppressed Tartarian original, then the story of progress on which modern identity depends is false. If the history taught in schools is a fabrication designed to serve the interests of those who perpetrated the greatest cover-up in human history, then the educated citizens of the modern world are not informed participants in a democratic civilization, but the domesticated inhabitants of an engineered reality. These are the stakes. They are enormous, and they help explain why the suppression has been so thorough and so sustained, and why the researchers who have pushed against it have encountered such consistent and comprehensive institutional resistance. The Free Energy Empire, Tesla, Suppressed Science, and the Tartarian Legacy. Nikola Tesla died on January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan, alone and nearly penniless. He was 86 years old. He had, in his lifetime, accumulated well over 300 patents in 26 countries. He had invented the alternating current electrical system that powers the entire modern world. He had developed radio communication before Marconi, a fact that the United States Supreme Court affirmed in 1943, the year of his death, in a ruling that had no practical effect because Marconi was already dead and Tesla's own patents had long since lapsed. He had pioneered X-ray research, demonstrated wireless power transmission, designed hydroelectric generators, and laid the theoretical foundations for radar, the electron microscope, the speedometer, and dozens of other technologies. He is, by any reasonable measure, the most important inventor in the history of modern civilization. And yet, at the moment of his death, he was broke, largely forgotten by the public, and in possession of notes and documents that the United States government was so anxious to control that FBI agents arrived at his hotel room within hours of his death to confiscate his papers. Papers that were subsequently classified and have never been fully released. Within days, a man named John G. Trump, a physicist and uncle of later US President Donald Trump, was dispatched by the Office of Alien Property to examine Tesla's remaining documents and assess their significance. Trump's official assessment was that Tesla's unpublished work contained nothing of significant value. Independent researchers, who have examined the portions of the Tesla papers that have subsequently been declassified, regard this assessment as almost comically implausible. The Tesla story is central to the Tartarian hypothesis for several reasons, and we want to be clear about what the researchers are and are not claiming. They are not claiming that Tesla was a Tartar, or that he had direct access to an intact Tartarian knowledge tradition. What they are claiming is that Tesla was, independently, rediscovering principles of physics that the Tartarian civilization had understood and applied. Principles concerning the electromagnetic properties of the Earth, the possibility of wireless energy transmission, and the existence of what Tesla called the wheelwork of nature, a phrase that referred to his understanding that the universe was permeated by energy that could be tapped and directed without the burning of any fuel. Tesla's own writings make clear that he understood himself to be working toward a specific and revolutionary goal: the elimination of the combustion-based energy system that was coming to dominate industrial civilization in his lifetime. He wanted to replace coal and oil with a clean, abundant, essentially free source of energy derived from the Earth's own electromagnetic field. His Wardenclyffe Tower project, begun in 1901 and abandoned due to the withdrawal of his primary funder, J.P. Morgan, in 1906, was designed to prove this principle at global scale. If it had worked, and Tesla was convinced that it would, the economic foundations of the new industrial order, the coal companies, the oil companies, the electrical utilities, would have been fundamentally undermined. This is why J.P. Morgan withdrew funding. The famous story of Morgan asking Tesla how he would meter the energy, and Tesla admitting that he couldn't. That free energy from the Earth's electromagnetic field would be, by its nature, available to anyone with the right receiving technology, is almost certainly apocryphal, but it captures a real dynamic. Morgan and the interests he represented were in the business of selling energy. A technology that made energy free was not a business opportunity. It was an existential threat. And so Morgan withdrew. The tower was demolished, and Tesla spent the last decades of his life in declining financial circumstances, unable to secure funding for the research that he believed was the most important work being done in the world. The maps showing its proposed global transmission range. Close-up of Tesla's handwritten notes. Period newspaper coverage of Tesla's research. The Tartarian researchers extend this story beyond the simple claim of corporate suppression, interesting and well documented as that claim is, to the larger argument that Tesla's work was suppressed because it was threatening to rediscover something that had already been suppressed once before. Tesla, in their reading, was not just an inconvenient inventor threatening the profits of industrial magnates. He was the closest anyone had come in the post-flood period to recovering the fundamental physical principles on which the Tartarian energy system had been based. His suppression was not just commercial, it was civilizational. It was the latest episode in the ongoing project of ensuring that the knowledge of the previous civilization did not re-emerge and challenge the legitimacy and control of the present one. This argument leads naturally to the question of where Tesla got his ideas. His own accounts of the origins of his insights are remarkable, and by the standards of conventional scientific biography, deeply strange. He described receiving insights in the form of sudden, complete visions, seeing mechanisms and systems whole, fully formed, requiring no calculation or derivation. He described his relationship to his own mind as something more like reception than production, as if he were accessing information from a source outside himself. Modern commentators tend to interpret this as the language of extraordinary intuitive intelligence, a mind so capable of unconscious synthesis that its products arrived in consciousness as apparently complete revelations. The Tartarian researchers propose a different interpretation, that Tesla was, in some sense, not fully understood by either himself or his contemporaries, a receiver, someone who had, through circumstances or capacity that remain obscure, access to a knowledge tradition that official history had suppressed, but that had not, at the deep level of physical principle, been entirely destroyed. This is, of course, deeply speculative, but it connects to a broader theme in Tartarian research: the idea that the suppressed knowledge of the old civilization did not disappear entirely, but persisted in fragments, in oral traditions, in encoded texts, in the physical infrastructure of the surviving buildings, and in the occasional individual whose combination of intellectual capacity and unusual cognitive style allowed them to recover aspects of the original understanding. Tesla is the most prominent of these figures, but the researchers identify others. Royal Rife, whose frequency-based medical technology was suppressed in the 1930s. Walter Russell, whose cosmological physics offered an account of the structure of matter radically different from the approved scientific framework. Victor Schauberger, the Austrian inventor who studied the vorticular properties of water and air and developed technologies based on principles that mainstream physics does not acknowledge. And, more recently, various independent researchers who have claimed to have developed working models of electromagnetic energy collection devices. Devices that are, without exception, either dismissed by mainstream science or, in the most dramatic cases, subject to specific legal and regulatory actions that effectively prevent them from reaching commercial development. To understand the Tartarian technology argument in its full scope, we need to engage with a specific claim about the nature of physical reality that sits at the heart of the hypothesis. This claim is about ether, or, in its modern reformulation, about the properties of the vacuum, the nature of electromagnetic fields, and the relationship between matter and energy at the fundamental physical level. The classical concept of the ether, a medium pervading all space through which electromagnetic waves propagated, was part of the standard framework of 19th century physics. Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism were originally formulated in terms of etheric fields. The famous Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887, which failed to detect the expected variation in the speed of light due to the Earth's motion through the ether, is conventionally described as the death blow to the ether concept and the precursor to Einstein's special relativity, which dispensed with the ether altogether and replaced it with a framework in which space was defined by the geometry of space-time rather than the properties of a medium. The Tartarian researchers, and a significant minority of physicists and electrical engineers who work outside the mainstream, argue that this transition from etheric to relativistic physics was not a neutral scientific development, but a specific choice that foreclosed certain technological possibilities. Specifically, the ether concept, even in its 19th century form, implied the possibility of tapping the energy of the etheric medium, using the properties of the medium through which electromagnetic waves propagated to extract usable energy. If you replace the ether with a mathematically elegant but physically contentless space-time geometry, this possibility disappears from the conceptual framework. There is no longer any medium to tap. Energy can only come from matter, from the controlled combustion or fission of material substances. The Tartarian researchers argue that this is not a coincidence. The shift from etheric to relativistic physics, which occurred significantly in the years immediately following Tesla's most ambitious attempts to demonstrate ether-based energy technology, served the interests of those who wanted to ensure that the energy production paradigm remained material-based and therefore commercially controllable. By replacing the ether with space-time, physics became not just a description of the universe, but a specific description that ruled out, by definitional fiat, the kind of energy technology that Tesla was pursuing, and that the Tartarian civilization had, the researchers claim, already developed and used. This argument will strike physicists as perverse, as a misunderstanding of the actual development of physics that substitutes conspiracy for science. And it should be said clearly that the mainstream physics community, with very few exceptions, does not accept the ether hypothesis or any of its modern reformulations. Quantum field theory, the best confirmed theory in the history of physics, does describe a vacuum that is not empty, that contains quantum fields with real energy, the so-called vacuum energy or zero-point energy. But the extraction of usable work from vacuum energy is forbidden by the laws of thermodynamics and the principle of energy conservation, and no credible physical mechanism for such extraction has been identified. Nevertheless, the Tartarian researchers persist in their claim that the properties of the electromagnetic medium, whatever we call it, were understood and exploited by the pre-flood civilization in ways that our current physics does not accommodate. And they point, as supporting evidence, to specific anomalies in the physical properties of the buildings identified as Tartarian. Anomalies that, they argue, are most plausibly explained by an understanding of physics that is qualitatively different from our own. The most specific of these claims concerns the piezoelectric and paramagnetic properties of certain building materials used in supposedly Tartarian architecture. Granite, which is a primary building material in many of the buildings under discussion, is mildly piezoelectric, meaning that it generates an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress, and conversely, undergoes mechanical deformation when subjected to an electrical field. Quartz, which is a major component of granite, is strongly piezoelectric and is used today in precision electronic components, including the timing crystals in virtually every electronic device. The researchers argue that the Tartarian builders understood these material properties and exploited them deliberately, that the specific choice of building materials in Tartarian architecture was not purely aesthetic or structural, but was related to the electromagnetic function of the buildings as energy collection and distribution devices. Again, this is a claim that cannot currently be verified or falsified by conventional scientific methods, because no controlled study of the electromagnetic properties of supposedly Tartarian buildings has been conducted. But it is not, the researchers argue, self-evidently absurd. Piezoelectric effects in geological materials are real. The electromagnetic properties of architectural spaces are real and measurable. The question of whether these properties were deliberately engineered in specific historical buildings is a genuinely open one, or should be if the scientific community were willing to engage with it. Let us connect the Tesla story more directly to the broader Tartarian architectural framework. The Tartarian researchers argue that the grand civic buildings identified as Tartarian, the domed structures, the spired towers, the elaborately ornamented facades, were not just aesthetically impressive. They were functional components of a global electromagnetic energy distribution network. The specific features of these buildings, the domes of specific proportions, the towers of specific height to base ratios, the geometric patterns of specific spatial frequencies, the specific orientations relative to local electromagnetic conditions, were not chosen for their beauty, but for their electromagnetic properties. Tesla's own research, in the period from approximately 1899 to 1906, was specifically aimed at demonstrating the feasibility of this principle at modern scale. His Colorado Springs experiments demonstrated that it was possible to transmit large amounts of electrical power wirelessly through the Earth and atmosphere. His Wardenclyffe Tower was designed to operate on a global scale, using the Earth's own resonant frequency, approximately 7.83 Hz, which corresponds to what we now know as the Schumann resonance, a physical reality that Tesla identified decades before it was formally described in scientific literature, to distribute energy wirelessly to any point on the globe. The Tartarian researchers argue that this is what the domes and towers of the pre-flood architecture were doing, operating as a global network of Wardenclyffe-type energy distribution nodes, harvesting energy from the Earth's electromagnetic field and distributing it wirelessly. The specific proportions of the domes, which correlate in the researchers' analysis with specific electromagnetic wavelengths, were the resonant dimensions required to make each building an effective antenna and transmitter in this global network. The ornamental details, the geometric patterns, the repeating motifs, the mathematical precision of the surface decoration were not decoration at all. They were functional, the physical embodiment of mathematical relationships that optimize the electromagnetic response of the building's materials. If this framework is correct, it explains several things that otherwise remain mysterious. It explains why the buildings of the supposed Tartarian tradition are so consistent in their specific proportions across geography and culture, because consistency was required by the physics of the network. A global resonant energy distribution system would require its nodes to be tuned to specific, shared frequencies, just as the components of a modern radio broadcasting network must be tuned to specific frequencies to function as a system. It explains why the buildings are so large, because larger resonant structures capture more energy. It explains why they are made of specific materials, because those materials have the electromagnetic properties required for the system to work. And it explains why their towers and spires were so prominent, because the towers were the transmitting and receiving antennae of the network. The Tartarian technology argument extends beyond energy to biology and medicine, an extension that connects to some of the most actively developed areas of current alternative science research. The claim is this: the Tartarian civilization understood and worked with the electromagnetic properties of living systems. It knew that living organisms are not just biochemical machines, but electromagnetic phenomena, that every cell, every organ, every tissue operates according to electromagnetic principles, and that the health or disease of an organism is, at a fundamental level, a function of its electromagnetic coherence. It possessed technologies, therapeutic applications of specific electromagnetic frequencies that could diagnose and address disease at this fundamental level, rather than at the chemical level that modern medicine addresses exclusively. The researchers who make this claim point to the work of specific 20th century scientists who developed electromagnetic approaches to medicine and were systematically suppressed. Royal Raymond Rife is the most prominent. Rife was an American inventor who in the 1930s developed a microscope capable of visualizing living viruses and bacteria, something that conventional optical microscopes cannot do, and claimed to have identified specific electromagnetic frequencies that could destroy specific disease microorganisms. He reportedly demonstrated complete cures of cancer and infectious disease using his frequency technology, and his work attracted significant attention before it was aggressively suppressed by the American Medical Association and the broader medical establishment. The mainstream explanation for the suppression of Rife's work is that his claims were unverifiable, that his microscopy techniques could not be independently replicated, that his cancer cures could not be confirmed by controlled trials, and that his technology was therefore appropriately dismissed by a scientific establishment that had been burned too many times by the claims of charlatans. The Tartarian researchers acknowledge that Rife's specific claims have not been independently verified, but they argue that the pattern of his suppression, the personal destruction of his reputation, the physical destruction of his equipment, the legal harassment that consumed his later years, is more consistent with the deliberate suppression of genuinely threatening technology than with the normal process of scientific skepticism applied to unverified claims. Similar patterns appear in the careers of Wilhelm Reich, orgone energy, suppressed by the FDA in the 1950s; Robert Beck, electromagnetic medical devices, suppressed in various ways throughout the 1980s and 1990s; and numerous less well-known researchers who have developed electromagnetic approaches to health and found themselves facing institutional, legal, and sometimes physical opposition that, in the researchers' assessment, far exceeds what would be warranted by mere scientific skepticism. The argument here is not that all alternative medicine is derived from Tartarian technology. It is that specific approaches to human health, those based on the electromagnetic properties of biological systems, represent a tradition of knowledge that the Tartarian civilization possessed, that the post-flood power structure suppressed because it was incompatible with the commercial medicine paradigm it had established, and that continues to re-emerge in fragments in the work of independent researchers who arrive at these principles through their own investigation and find, consistently, that the institutional response to their work is suppression rather than engagement. Beyond energy and medicine, the Tartarian researchers claim that the old civilization had a cosmological understanding, an understanding of the structure and nature of the universe that is qualitatively different from the cosmology of modern physics, and that this cosmological understanding was the source of the specific architectural, energetic, and biological knowledge they are claiming. The centerpiece of this cosmological claim is the concept of the electric universe, the idea that gravity, rather than being the dominant force on the cosmic scale, is secondary to electromagnetic forces that operate across astronomical distances. The electric universe model, developed in the 20th century by figures including Hannes Orphan, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1970 for his work on plasma physics, proposes that the universe is permeated by plasma, ionized matter that conducts electricity, and that the large-scale structures of the universe, including galaxies and solar systems, are shaped and maintained primarily by electromagnetic rather than gravitational forces. This model has significant implications for our understanding of everything from solar activity to geological change to the properties of the Earth's electromagnetic environment. And it is, the Tartarian researchers argue, the theoretical framework within which the Tartarian energy technology makes sense. A universe that is fundamentally electromagnetic, in which the Earth is not just a rock in gravitational orbit, but a charged electrical body participating in a complex system of cosmic electromagnetic interactions, is a universe in which the collection and distribution of electromagnetic energy is not just technically feasible, but naturally integrated into the physics of the world. The conventional cosmological model, based on gravitational mechanics, the Big Bang, dark matter, and dark energy, does not accommodate this understanding. But the electric universe proponents argue that the conventional models need to invoke large quantities of invisible, undetected matter and energy, dark matter and dark energy, together supposedly comprising 95% of the universe's content, is itself an indication that something is fundamentally wrong with the model. An alternative model that accounts for the same observations without invoking invisible and undetectable entities is, by the standard principles of scientific parsimony, preferable. Lightning, auroras, solar prominences, diagrams of electric universe cosmology, close-up of aurora borealis, images of galactic plasma jets, comparisons of electric universe predictions with conventional cosmology predictions for specific phenomena. Let us bring the various strands of the Tartarian technology argument together into a coherent picture. The Tartarian civilization, in the view of its researchers, was built on a fundamentally different understanding of physical reality than the one that underlies modern Western science. This understanding, call it electric universe cosmology, or etheric physics, or electromagnetic naturalism, placed electromagnetic interactions at the center of both the physical and biological world. It recognized that the Earth was an electromagnetic body whose properties could be harnessed for energy, for health, for communication, and for the enhancement of biological function. It expressed this understanding in architecture, in buildings that were designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field in functionally specific ways. And it used this understanding as the basis for a civilization of extraordinary capability and extraordinary quality of life. When this civilization was destroyed, whether by natural catastrophe, by warfare, or by some combination, the knowledge tradition on which it was based was lost, or nearly lost. The new power structure that emerged in the aftermath did not possess this knowledge, and, crucially, was invested in developing an alternative energy paradigm, a combustion-based system that was commercially controllable in ways that the Tartarian electromagnetic system was not. The suppression of the Tartarian knowledge tradition was therefore not purely about concealing the historical record. It was about ensuring that the alternative energy paradigm never re-emerged and challenged the commercial system on which the new power structure's economic foundations rested. Tesla threatened this system. Rife threatened this system. Schauberger threatened this system. And each of them was, in one way or another, destroyed for the threat they represented. Their stories are not isolated tales of suppressed genius. They are episodes in a continuing struggle over the nature of the knowledge tradition that will underpin human civilization. A struggle that the Tartarian researchers place in a long historical context, extending back to the catastrophe that ended the old world and beginning the project of building the new one. In Part 6, the final part of this documentary, we will bring everything together. We will ask the largest questions. Who ran the Tartarian civilization, and who overthrew it? We will look at the specific historical evidence for the identity of the post-flood power structure, the group that the researchers most often identify in various formulations as the architects of the Great Reset. We will consider what the recovery of the Tartarian knowledge tradition would mean for the world today, and we will reflect on why this story, this alternative reading of human history, has attracted hundreds of thousands of researchers and millions of followers over the past decade, and what that fact tells us about the world we live in and the world we might be trying to build. But before we close, let us return for a moment to Tesla, because his story does not end with his death in 1943. The papers confiscated from his hotel room were classified and held by the Office of Alien Property for years, before being transferred in 1952 to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade. But many researchers believe that what was transferred to Belgrade was not everything that was seized, that specific documents relating to his most advanced electromagnetic research were retained by the American government and have never been released. The FOIA requests that have been filed over the decades have produced incomplete results. Some documents, but not all. Some records, but not those relating to the most sensitive research areas. What was in those documents? The Tartarian researchers have various hypotheses. Some believe they contain detailed engineering specifications for the Wardenclyffe system, specifications that would allow its reconstruction. Some believe they contain theoretical work on the electromagnetic properties of the Earth that went significantly beyond what Tesla published in his lifetime. Some believe they contained records of experiments that demonstrated effects: free energy from the vacuum, long-range wireless power transmission, electromagnetic biological effects, that the scientific establishment of the time was not prepared to acknowledge, and that the intelligence agencies handling Tesla's legacy were specifically instructed to suppress. We do not know. We may never know. But the question remains open, and it remains one of the most tantalizing threads in the broader tapestry of suppressed knowledge that the Tartarian researchers are attempting to reconstruct. Because if Tesla was indeed recovering the principles of the Tartarian energy tradition, if his work on wireless power, his conception of the Earth as a resonant electromagnetic sphere, his intuition that energy could be extracted from the fundamental electromagnetic field of the universe, were not original inventions, but recoveries of lost knowledge, then the suppression of his work was not just a commercial crime against one man. It was the continuation of a project of civilizational control that began, the researchers argue, in the early 19th century, with the mud flood and the Great Reset. And it is a project that, they argue, continues to the present day. The architects of the cover-up. Who rules the narrative, and what comes next? We have spent 5 parts of this documentary examining the evidence for a lost civilization. We have looked at the maps that show Tartaria, at the geology that records the mud flood, at the architecture that preserves the physical memory of what was built before, at the institutional suppression of the knowledge and artifacts that would have told the story. We have considered the technology that the Tartarian civilization may have possessed, and the fate of those who, in more recent times, attempted to recover it. We have built, in other words, a circumstantial case of considerable weight, a case that, taken seriously, suggests that the history we have been taught is false in its most fundamental dimensions. Now we come to the most difficult question. Not what happened. We have, at least in outline, the researchers' answer to that. But who made it happen? Who overthrew the Tartarian civilization? Who managed the Great Reset? Who built the institutions of historical control? Who suppressed Tesla and Rife and the others? And who, if anyone, is still managing the deception today? These questions lead into territory that is, by the nature of the inquiry, speculative. The Tartarian researchers themselves disagree significantly on the identity and nature of the post-flood power structure. Some speak in terms of specific historical groups, secret societies, banking dynasties, international institutional networks. Others speak in more abstract terms, a systemic logic of power that does not require specific actors to explain its effects. Some believe the cover-up was primarily a human project, the result of deliberate choices by identifiable individuals and institutions. Others believe it involved forces that are, by any conventional account, beyond the human, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or in some accounts, demonic. We are going to stay, as much as possible, in the territory of the human and the evidential. Not because we definitively reject the more exotic explanations, but because the human and evidential explanation is already remarkable enough to warrant serious attention. And because adding layers of speculative metaphysics to an already speculative historical argument risks undermining the very real and very important questions that the Tartarian researchers are raising. The question of who ran the post-flood transition is, in the researchers' framework, inseparable from the question of who had the most to gain from the suppression of the Tartarian civilization's legacy. If the Tartarian civilization had, as the researchers claim, a non-combustion energy technology, one that produced abundant, clean, essentially free energy, then the combustion-based industrial economy that replaced it was not just a technological alternative. It was a power system, a means of controlling human populations through control of the energy on which those populations depended. Whoever owned the coal mines, the oil wells, the electrical utilities, and the financial systems that funded and organized their development was, in this framework, not just a businessman. They were a ruler, a controller of the fundamental resource on which modern life depended. The emergence of the great industrial and financial dynasties of the 19th century, the Rockefellers in oil, the Morgans in finance, the Carnegies in steel, coincides almost exactly with the period in which the Tartarian researchers locate the Great Reset. Standard Oil, the company through which John D. Rockefeller gained control of the American petroleum industry, was founded in 1870, precisely the period in which the mud flood aftermath was at its most active, in which American cities were being rebuilt on the ruins of the pre-flood landscape, and in which the institutions of historical control were being established. The House of Morgan, the financial empire that blocked Tesla's most ambitious projects and shaped the development of American industrial capitalism, traces its roots to the same period. The researchers are not claiming a simple conspiracy in which these individuals consciously colluded to suppress Tartarian knowledge. The claim is more structural, that the specific economic model they were building, the combustion-based, commercially controlled energy economy, was structurally incompatible with the Tartarian energy tradition, and that the interests of those who benefited from this economic model therefore aligned with the suppression of the Tartarian tradition, regardless of whether any of them fully understood what they were suppressing. But some of them, the researchers argue, did understand, at least in part. And the institution that best illustrates this understanding is not an oil company or a bank, but a more fundamental one: the network of Freemasonic and Rosicrucian secret societies that had been actively operating in Europe and America for centuries. The connection between secret societies and the Tartarian hypothesis is one of the most sensitive and most frequently discussed aspects of the researcher's framework. We approach it with care because it is the dimension most easily caricatured and most easily used to dismiss the broader argument by association with the stereotypical secret society controls the world narrative. The researcher's claim is not that simple. It is more specific and more interesting. The claim is that certain esoteric traditions, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and related schools of thought, preserved in encoded and symbolic form fragments of the Tartarian knowledge tradition. That these traditions were, in other words, the custodians of a suppressed inheritance, not rulers who actively managed the suppression, but keepers of a flame that they understood, to varying degrees, to represent something more than mere ritual. The evidence for this claim is primarily symbolic. The architectural symbolism of Freemasonic tradition is explicitly centered on architecture, specifically on the architecture of Solomon's Temple, which in the Masonic understanding represents the ideal structure, the perfect building, the culmination of architectural wisdom. The Masonic Lodge Room is designed as a microcosm of this ideal architecture, with specific geometric relationships, specific symbolic elements, and specific orientations that, the researchers argue, encode the principles of Tartarian architectural knowledge in symbolic form. The compass and square of Freemasonry are not just tools. They are the tools of geometric precision, the tools through which the Tartarian architectural tradition expressed its understanding of space, proportion, and electromagnetic function. Similarly, the Rosicrucian tradition preserves a specific cosmological understanding, one that is strikingly close to the electric universe model that the Tartarian researchers associate with the old civilization's physics. The Rosicrucian cosmology centers on the concept of universal vital force, a cosmic energy that permeates all matter and that living organisms can access and direct. This concept maps very closely onto the Tartarian electromagnetic energy concept, the idea that the universe is permeated by a usable energy field that the right technologies can harness. The relationship between secret societies and the post-flood power structure is complex in the researchers' account. On one hand, these societies preserved fragments of the old knowledge. On the other, they were embedded in and often served the interests of the new power structure. Some researchers argue that the Masonic network was actively involved in managing the post-flood transition, that its members occupied key positions in the new institutions of governance, commerce, and knowledge control, and that their possession of esoteric knowledge gave them specific advantages in understanding and managing the landscape they were inheriting. Others argue that the secret societies were themselves victims of the Great Reset, that they had preserved knowledge that the overthrowing power wanted to suppress, and that their semi-secret existence reflected a genuine need for protection against the same forces that had destroyed the open Tartarian tradition. This tension between the secret societies as agents of suppression and as custodians of suppressed knowledge runs through much of the Tartarian research community's discussion of the post-flood power structure, and we cannot resolve it definitively here. What we can say is that the specific architectural symbolism of Freemasonry, with its emphasis on the temple as the ideal building, its encoding of geometric principles, and its preservation of a tradition of craft knowledge that traces its origins to a pre-modern, and in some accounts, prehistoric, architectural wisdom, is consistent with the idea that certain members of these traditions understood, at some level, that the great buildings around them were not the products of their own civilization, but the inheritance of an older one. It is at this point that the Tartarian research framework makes its most direct claims about the present. Because the researchers are not simply engaged in historical reconstruction for its own sake, they are engaged in an argument about power, about who has it, how it was obtained, and what it would mean to challenge it. The specific claim about the present is this: the post-flood power structure, having established its control in the 19th century, has maintained and extended that control through the 20th and into the 21st. The institutions it established, the great financial systems, the energy companies, the knowledge control mechanisms, the systems of cultural production and education are still operating. The suppression of the Tartarian knowledge tradition is still being enforced, and the result is a civilization that is, in certain fundamental respects, impoverished, that lacks access to technologies and knowledge that would transform the quality of human life, because the power structure that manages it has a direct interest in keeping those technologies and that knowledge suppressed. The energy argument is the clearest expression of this claim. The world of the 21st century remains overwhelmingly dependent on combustion-based energy, oil, gas, coal, and the nuclear fission of uranium. Despite decades of effort and enormous investment, renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydro, supply only a minority of the world's energy needs and face fundamental physical and logistical limitations that make it difficult to see how they could fully replace combustion in the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, the possibility of genuinely free, clean, abundant energy from the electromagnetic properties of the Earth and the vacuum remains officially dismissed as pseudoscience, and the researchers who pursue it continue to face the same pattern of institutional marginalization and legal harassment that characterize the treatment of Tesla, Rife, and the others. The health argument is equally pointed. Modern Western medicine is extraordinarily capable in certain areas: surgical technique, acute trauma management, the treatment of specific infectious diseases, and extraordinarily poor in others. Chronic disease, particularly cancer, heart disease, and the growing array of metabolic and autoimmune conditions, remains largely beyond its reach. And the specific approach to health that the Tartarian researchers associate with the old tradition, electromagnetic medicine, frequency-based therapy, the treatment of disease at the level of the organism's electromagnetic coherence rather than its biochemistry, remains officially dismissed, its practitioners subject to legal and professional consequences for practicing it. Let us now step back from the specific claims of the Tartarian hypothesis and consider, briefly, the sociological reality of the community that has developed it. Because however one assesses the specific historical and scientific claims, the existence of this community, its size, its energy, its methodology, and its persistence, is itself a significant cultural phenomenon that demands some reflection. The Tartarian research community is genuinely global. It includes people from every country, every educational background, every professional field. It includes engineers, historians, architects, geologists, physicists, and people with no formal academic training. It communicates primarily through video sharing platforms and online forums: YouTube, Telegram, Reddit, various independent websites. Its internal culture is generally one of genuine intellectual inquiry, people sharing evidence, challenging each other's interpretations, proposing alternative explanations, arguing about specific claims. It is not, on the whole, a community of passive consumers of a pre-packaged ideology. It is a community of active researchers engaged in a genuine and often rigorous investigation of anomalies in the historical record. What brought this community together? Partly, the accessibility of digitized historical archives. The ability to look at old maps, old photographs, and old architectural surveys that were previously accessible only to professional academics. Partly, the democratization of intellectual production that internet platforms enabled. The ability for people outside the academic establishment to share findings with large audiences without institutional gatekeeping. And partly, the researchers themselves would say, the simple act of looking at the buildings around them and the photographs of the past and the history they had been taught, and finding that these things didn't quite fit together, that the official story contained gaps and contradictions and anomalies that, once noticed, could not be unnoticed. There is something important in this. The Tartarian research community, whatever the accuracy of its specific claims, represents a genuine democratization of historical inquiry, a refusal to accept that the interpretation of the past is the exclusive province of credentialed experts. It represents, in other words, a challenge not just to specific historical claims, but to the epistemological authority of the institutions that have managed the production and distribution of historical knowledge. This challenge is part of a broader cultural moment, a moment of significant institutional distrust, of widespread questioning of official narratives, of a growing conviction among large numbers of people that the story they have been told about the world does not match their direct experience of it. The Tartarian researchers are, in this sense, part of a larger movement, not a political movement, exactly, though it has political dimensions, but an epistemological one, a movement toward what might be called investigative sovereignty, the insistence on the individual's right and responsibility to examine primary evidence directly and draw their own conclusions, rather than accepting the interpretations offered by institutions whose interests may not be aligned with the truth. We have presented this documentary as an exploration of the Tartarian hypothesis, rather than an uncritical endorsement of it. And we want, in this final section, to address the most serious criticisms of the hypothesis as honestly as we can. The most significant criticism is, frankly, the most difficult to dismiss: the absence of direct physical evidence for the Tartarian civilization as the researchers describe it. If Tartaria was the dominant civilizational entity on Earth for several centuries, possessing advanced technology, building enormous cities, maintaining a global electromagnetic energy network, where's the evidence? Where are the Tartarian texts, the Tartarian artifacts, the Tartarian manufacturing facilities, the Tartarian communications networks? The researchers' answer is that the evidence was destroyed in the mud flood and subsequently suppressed by the new power order. But this is a convenient answer. It makes the hypothesis unfalsifiable, able to explain the absence of evidence as itself evidence of suppression. And unfalsifiable hypotheses, as every student of philosophy of science knows, are epistemologically problematic. The second major criticism concerns the architectural argument. The claim that the grand civic buildings of the world were built by a pre-flood Tartarian civilization, rather than by the architects and builders to whom they are officially credited, requires us to accept that the detailed documentary record of these buildings' construction, the architectural drawings, the contracts, the construction logs, the contemporary descriptions, the photographs of construction in progress, is either fabricated or fundamentally misrepresenting what was actually happening. For a small number of buildings, in a small number of locations, this might be plausible. For the hundreds of buildings across dozens of countries that the researchers identify as Tartarian, it requires an implausibly comprehensive and coordinated falsification of the historical record. The third major criticism concerns the mud flood itself. If a catastrophic geological event of the scale described by the researchers occurred in the early 19th century, it should have left a clear and well-defined signature in the geological record, a specific stratigraphic horizon, identifiable in geological surveys around the world, corresponding to a sudden deposition of sediment. This signature has not been identified. The disturbed layers visible in urban archaeological contexts are, as mainstream geologists argue, entirely consistent with the cumulative effects of urban development and do not require a catastrophic event to explain them. These are serious objections. The researchers have responses to each of them. The documentary record is fabricated. The geological signature has been identified but misinterpreted by mainstream geology. The falsification of building records was institutionally organized and systematically maintained. But these responses, honest intellectual engagement requires us to acknowledge, are not fully satisfying. They rely heavily on the claim that counter-evidence is itself evidence of suppression, a logical move that, as noted, creates unfalsifiability. And yet, even acknowledging these limitations, the Tartarian hypothesis retains something that a simple dismissal fails to capture: the power of a coherent alternative framework for understanding a set of real anomalies in the historical record. The maps are real. The buried buildings are real. The architectural consistency is real. The suppression of Tesla and others like him is real, at least in broad outline. The founding of knowledge control institutions in the mid-19th century is real. The pattern of giant skeleton reports and their institutional dismissal, while unverified, is documented across too many independent sources to be simply invented. What the Tartarian hypothesis offers is a framework, a single, coherent, explanatory structure that accounts for all of these anomalies simultaneously. Whether every specific claim within the framework is accurate is a separate question from whether the framework itself is pointing at something important. And we believe it is pointing at something important, a gap between the official story of human history and the full reality of the human past that is larger than conventional history acknowledges. The maps tell us that for nearly 3 centuries, educated Europeans recognized a large and significant civilizational presence in Central and Eastern Eurasia that they called Tartary. The architecture tells us that buildings of extraordinary scale and sophistication existed in places that could not, by any normal account, have produced them in the timeframes the official record assigns. The geology tells us that something significant happened to the landscape of many parts of the world in the early 19th century. The institutional history tells us that the 19th century was a period of intense and apparently motivated organization of knowledge production, with specific categories of evidence systematically excluded from the official record. These are real phenomena. They deserve better than the institutional dismissal they have received from mainstream academia. And whether the specific Tartarian hypothesis, the grand, sweeping, comprehensive alternative history, is the correct account of them is almost less important than the fact that they are being investigated at all. That people outside the academy are looking at primary evidence and asking the questions that the academy should have asked and failed to ask. Approaching the conclusion, we want to close this documentary by returning to the maps that started this story. Because there is something in those maps that is, we believe, irreducible, that cannot be explained away by the standard academic dismissals, that cannot be accounted for by the claim that Tartary was just a vague European label for unknown territory. The maps, the hundreds of maps, produced by dozens of independent cartographic traditions over a period of nearly 3 centuries, show something. They show a large, organized, well-characterized entity in the central and eastern portions of the world. They show it with borders, with internal subdivisions, with named cities and rivers and mountain ranges. They show it with the same degree of care and specificity that they show France, Spain, England, and the Ottoman Empire. They show it as real. And for 3 centuries, every educated European who looked at a map knew it was there. It was part of the world, as real as any other part. And then, within a generation, it was gone. Not just from the maps, but from memory, from education, from the stories cultures tell about themselves. Gone so thoroughly that 200 years later, the overwhelming majority of educated people have never heard of it. That is not how things normally disappear. Nations are conquered, but their names remain in the historical record. Empires collapse, but their ruins persist and are studied and commemorated. Civilizations decline, but their languages, their arts, their architecture, their philosophies survive in some form, carried forward by successor cultures or preserved by diligent historians. The total disappearance of Tartaria from human cultural memory within a single historical generation and at a time of unprecedented cartographic knowledge and cultural documentation is not a normal historical event. It is an extraordinary one, and extraordinary events demand extraordinary explanations. The Tartarian hypothesis offers one such explanation. It may not be the correct one in all its details. The specific claims about energy technology, about giant populations, about deliberate fires and institutional suppression, about Tesla as a Tartarian heir, these are speculative and unverified, some more than others. But the core of the hypothesis, that a significant civilizational presence existed in the central and eastern Eurasia for centuries, that something catastrophic happened to it in the early 19th century, and that the aftermath of this catastrophe was managed in ways that specifically prevented its historical record from being preserved. This core rests on evidence that is harder to dismiss. The Tartarian researchers are asking the right questions. They may not have all the right answers, but the right questions, asked persistently and openly, and without deference to institutional authority, are more valuable than the wrong answers given with the full weight of official credentialing behind them. The history of human knowledge is the history of people who asked questions they were told not to ask, who looked at things they were told not to look at, who refused to accept that the official story was the whole story. Galileo was told not to look through the telescope. He looked anyway. The doctors who first proposed that infectious disease was caused by microorganisms were ridiculed and marginalized. The geologists who first proposed continental drift were dismissed as fantasists. The astronomers who discovered that the universe was expanding were met with institutional resistance that lasted decades. In every case, the uncomfortable truth eventually prevailed, not because institutions decided to accept it, but because the evidence was compelling enough that it could not be indefinitely suppressed. The Tartarian researchers believe they are the latest episode in this long story of uncomfortable truth struggling against institutional comfort. They may be right. They may not be right in every specific claim, but they are asking the fundamental question that every honest person who looks carefully at the history of this planet must eventually confront. Is the story we have been told the whole story? Is the world we inhabit the natural culmination of everything that came before? Or did something happen, something enormous, something deliberately obscured that made it what it is? The maps say something happened. The architecture says something happened. The geology says something happened. The pattern of institutional suppression says something was at stake. What was Tartaria? We do not know, not fully, not with certainty. We know the shape of what we don't know. We know that a large, organized, apparently sophisticated entity existed in the center of the world for 300 years and then disappeared. We know that the buildings that surround us in our cities are, in many cases, older and more mysterious than the stories attached to them. We know that the energy system we depend on and the knowledge systems that support it are specific choices made in specific historical circumstances for specific interests, and that different choices were possible, are possible, and may once have been made. We know that the suppression of knowledge is real, that the history of science and medicine and technology is the history of repeated, systematic suppression of ideas that threatened established power. We know that institutions lie, not always out of malice, but out of the deep structural conservatism of any system that benefits from the current state of things. We know that the truth is often not where the authorities point, but where they pointedly do not point. And we know, because the maps tell us, because the buildings tell us, because the buried streets and the orphan trains and the suppressed papers of dead geniuses tell us, that the world has not always been as it is now, that something came before, that something was lost, and that the recovery of what was lost, the rediscovery of the Tartarian inheritance, whatever form that ultimately takes, is not just a historical project, but a civilizational one. It is, perhaps, the most important project of our time.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.